To understand the Perceval legend, it is first necessary to look at how the story has reached us. There is no single, fixed version. Instead, the narrative survives in many different forms, shaped over centuries. Some versions appear in verse, others in prose. Some were stabilized later through printing, while others remain scattered across handwritten copies that were never fully compared. Any serious investigation must therefore treat the surviving material as a whole, weighing each version against the others. At the centre of this tradition stands the Perceval attributed to Chrétien de Troyes. Regardless of differing opinions about the poet himself, this work became the foundation of the entire cycle. Its scale and influence make it the key reference point for tracing how the legend formed and evolved. The surviving material is extensive. Numerous manuscripts, an early printed prose version, and several translations into other languages. Together, they show how widely the story travelled and how freely it was reshaped. The manuscripts are spread across Europe. Copies survive in France, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, and Britain. Although they tell the same basic story, they often differ in structure, length, and detail. Some preserve longer and more complex narratives. Others shorten events or remove entire episodes. Certain copies add new adventures or explanations, while others alter names and scenes, sometimes through misunderstanding, sometimes through deliberate revision. These variations reveal that the Perceval story was never static, but constantly adapted to new contexts. Some early French manuscripts preserve clearer and more coherent versions, while later copies introduced theological material and expanded endings that reflect changing ideas about the Grail. One widely known version, although influential, is also among the least reliable, having simplified or altered key passages. Even so, its circulation shaped how the legend was later understood. Manuscripts preserved in Britain are especially important, as they differ not only from continental versions but also from one another. They preserve rare details, alternative openings, and narrative features that influenced later printed texts. The printed prose version of the 16th century reflects this mixed tradition. In some copies, additional introductory material was added after printing had already begun, showing that the story remained open to modification even in print. Beyond the French tradition, a German translation sought to align the Perceval story with another major narrative, while still preserving the structure of a strong French source. A Dutch version goes even further, embedding the Perceval story within a different cycle and continuing it in a form no longer found in surviving French manuscripts. The Icelandic versions known as Fardval and Valvas, Tata, represent a highly condensed form of the Perceval story. 4 manuscripts of this abridgment survive today, preserved in Stockholm, Copenhagen, and London. Although the narrative broadly follows the outline of Chrétien's poem, it is so heavily shortened that it offers little help for detailed comparison. The translator appears to have known only Chrétien's version, and nowhere shows awareness of the later continuations. However, the Icelandic text introduces a new ending to Perceval's story. After his meeting with the hermit, Perceval returns to Blanchefleur, marries her, and becomes ruler of her land. The later adventures of Gawain are detached from this conclusion and presented separately under the title Valva's Thatr. The text was first edited in the 19th century, but its importance lies more in showing how the story was reshaped for a different audience than in preserving early material. The Flemish fragments tell a slightly different story. 2 surviving pieces were published at the end of the 19th century. The first fragment begins in the middle of the tournament at Tintagel and continues until Gawain is discovered with the Lady of Escavallon. This version does not match the Dutch tradition at this point, indicating an independent line of transmission. The second fragment resumes at the end of the Escavalon episode, where Gawain promises to seek the spear and concludes with the hermit's warning to Perceval that he must keep the prayer he has learned secret. The warning states that the sacred names must never be spoken over water or aloud. This ending corresponds to no known French version. The Dutch translation omits this episode entirely and preserves only the Gawain material, suggesting selective transmission rather than accidental loss. These texts form the foundation for any attempt to understand how Chrétien's poem originated and how it developed. The question immediately arises whether it is possible to arrange the surviving material in any clear sequence, or to define the relationships between the versions with any precision. Some scholars have argued that a fully scientific classification of the Perceval manuscripts is impossible, pointing to the extreme variation even among texts that appear closely related. The differences are so extensive that any attempt to reconstruct a single authoritative version would be speculative at best. For this reason, the aim here is not to establish a definitive text, but rather to identify broad patterns that can serve as a working framework. Across the surviving material, two main forms of the narrative emerge. One is longer and more complex, the other shorter and more compressed. In addition to these, several major variants recur across different versions. These include the episode of the breaking of the Grail sword, a substantial group of adventures involving Gawain, and a smaller but distinct group centred on Perceval himself. There are also secondary differences, such as alternate endings to the story of the knight in the tomb, different introductions to the episode at Chastel Orgelus, and varying accounts of the maiden who tries to drown Perceval. These secondary elements tend to align with the larger groupings and do not fundamentally alter the overall structure. The crucial question is which of the two main forms reflects the earliest version of the story. For a long time, the shorter form was widely assumed to be older. This belief was not based on a systematic comparison of the texts, but rather on the assumption that the repeated visit to the Grail Castle found in the longer version must be the result of later copying. Without a critical addition, this assumption went largely unchallenged. Earlier studies adopted this position and treated the shorter version as the starting point. However, a close reading of the full range of material leads to a different conclusion. The longer version consistently provides clearer motivation for events that appear abrupt or unexplained in the shorter form. Nowhere is this more evident than in the sequence involving Gawain, Guiremelons, and the events surrounding Escavalon. Up to the moment of Gawain's duel with Guiremelons and the desperate appeal of Clarisons, both versions follow the same path. After this point, the narratives diverge. In the longer form, Gawain refuses to abandon the duel unless his opponent withdraws the accusation made against him, although he agrees to delay the fight. Arthur decides to grant his niece's request and allows the marriage to proceed. When Gawain returns fully armed to resume the combat, he learns that the wedding is already taking place. Outraged, he leaves the court and vows not to return until Arthur himself comes to seek him with a great host. At this point, some manuscripts introduce a series of additional adventures. Gawain then remembers his vow to seek the bleeding lance and realizes that the time he had set for himself is almost over. He reaches the Grail Castle, but falls asleep and fails to learn its secret. Later, he encounters a knight named Disnadares, who bears a grievance against him. They fight, but decide that victory without witnesses brings no honour, and agree to meet again. Gawain then travels to Escavalon, declares his readiness to face Guiremelons, and begins arranging the combat. Disnadares arrives and claims his own right to fight. the king of Escavalon consults his barons, who rule that Gawain must face both challenges at once. A servant of Arthur's household, present at the court, hears of this danger and rides to warn the king. Arthur arrives, already searching for his nephew, and the conflict is resolved peacefully. Guiramilans and Disnadares submit to Arthur, marriages are arranged, alliances are formed, and Gawain is released from the oath forced upon him during his earlier humiliation. Every action follows logically from what came before. In the shorter version, this entire sequence disappears. Gawain simply agrees to the marriage. The conflict ends without explanation, and Guiramilans suddenly appears at Arthur's court as a loyal subject and royal son-in-law. No reason is given for his presence, no explanation for his change of allegiance. The mention of place names and shadowy figures with no narrative role suggests that the scribe was working from a longer text and removed material without fully understanding its function. Events that are coherent in the longer version become confusing or implausible in the shorter. For this reason, the longer form must be regarded as closer to the original structure of the story. Among the manuscripts preserving this version, one stands out. The Paris manuscript, known as 12,576, repeatedly emerges as the point to which other texts gravitate. It is neither the longest nor the shortest, but it is the most internally consistent. It shares nearly all of its content with the majority of surviving versions, and where it differs, the differences are minor. Its narrative clarity is unmatched, especially in complex sections where other manuscripts become confused or contradictory. When other texts are unclear, they can often be understood only by reference to this version. Its coherence, balance, and minimal alteration suggest that it preserves a form close to the narrative norm. For these reasons, it is best regarded as the strongest surviving representative of the Perceval tradition. Closely associated with it are a near-duplicate manuscript and a German translation that follows its structure with remarkable fidelity. Together, these form a primary group. A second group consists of later manuscripts that show signs of expansion and interpolation, but also preserve certain original passages omitted elsewhere. A third group represents an abridged form derived from a longer version, but retaining intermediate features. A final group includes texts that combine shortened structure with selective additions and show less internal consistency. Manuscripts containing only Chrétien's original portion generally align with the intermediate group, with one notable exception that appears to derive from a different source entirely. The sources that survive today are the ground on which any understanding of Perceval must stand. Both the story told by Chrétien de Troyes and the versions that grew around it later. The real challenge begins after the list of texts is assembled. The question becomes simple to ask and difficult to answer. What lies underneath this enormous body of material? And what are the older elements from which such a wide and complex compilation took shape? Anyone who has worked through these narratives closely knows how vast the tradition is, and how much variety sits beneath the surface of what seems, at first glance, like a single legend. Some voices argue there is no deep background at all. In that view, the story does not rise out of ancient tradition, but begins as the creation of one gifted writer, later expanded by a small number of imitators. If that were true, the entire Perceval world would be less a legacy of older storytelling and more the ripple effect of a single artistic decision. That claim sounds bold, but the best place to test it is the author most often treated as the starting point. Chrétien himself gives a clue about what he believed he was doing. After speaking about the need to plant seed in good soil if a rich harvest is to follow, and after praising his patron, Count Philip of Flanders, Chrétien turns to the work at hand and says, in effect, that his labour will be rewarded because he has been commanded by the Count to set into verse the finest story told in a royal court, the story of the Grail. The meaning of that is hard to ignore. Chrétien presents himself not as an inventor creating something new from nothing, but as a poet reshaping a tale already recognised as the best among courtly audiences. Such a story, described as the finest told in a royal hall, suggests a narrative that has already circulated widely, already proven its power, and already moved beyond pure oral performance into written form. It is treated as a book, a known story with an established reputation. That raises another possibility. Even if Chrétien did not invent the tale, perhaps his version became so influential that it replaced earlier forms, becoming the standard shape from which later romances were built. If that happened, then the surviving Perceval tradition would mostly be a family of texts descending from Chrétien. The only way to test that idea is to compare the versions side by side, beginning where stories often reveal their deepest differences. In the account of the hero's origins, the story of his parents, and the circumstances of his birth. At the most cautious count, there are at least 6 separate narrative traditions that can be placed next to one another. Chrétien's Perceval, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, the version often associated with Didot, the Perceval, the Middle English romance, Sire Perceval of Galles, and the Welsh Peredur. If the continuations attached to Chrétien's poem are treated separately from Chrétien's own portion, and if additional prologues and endings preserved elsewhere are included, the number of texts suitable for comparison rises sharply. Add to this the hints contained in the prose Lancelot and the Quest of the Grail, and the body of evidence becomes large enough to expose patterns rather than isolated accidents. Chrétien's version begins in an unusually restrained way. The father and mother are not named. The father is described as wounded in the hips, and then, after the death of Utherpendragon, stripped of lands and wealth and driven into exile unjustly. He has a dwelling in the woods and has himself carried there. At this time, Perceval is 2 years old, and he has 2 older brothers. When they reach an appropriate age, one is sent to the court of King Ban of Gomeret, and the other to the court of the king of Escavalon. Both are knighted on the same day, and both are killed on the same day, ambushed while travelling home to visit their parents. Their father dies of grief after their deaths. About the mother's family, only fragments appear. She claims her lineage is among the best of the islands of the sea, and later it becomes clear she is sister to the Fisher King and to a hermit. Whether that implies a connection to Joseph of Arimathea is impossible to state with certainty, especially because Chrétien's poem ends before it can fully explain its own mythology. Still, a quiet emphasis is placed on the mother's rank. She boasts of her lineage more than her husband's, suggesting she may be the higher-born figure in the household. The continuations and parallel traditions quickly drift away from that starting point. In one continuation, Perceval has a sister who remains in the forest after the mother dies. A hermit uncle appears, linked to the father's side, and the mother is buried in his chapel. Yet Perceval also speaks as if he had been raised in the forest at his mother's place, implying a hermit relative connected to her as well. In this version, the sister is older than Perceval, though her name is not given. In another continuation, the story becomes uncertain and contradictory. Perceval is treated as nephew and likely heir of the Fisher King, but the family connection is described first as coming through the father and then through the mother, without any stable explanation. Perceval has a brother, commonly called Aglaval. A different continuation provides far more detail. Here, the father is given a name. The mother's identity is wrapped in secrecy, to the point that Perceval says he knew her only as Mother. while she called him dear son. Her name was never spoken openly, and no one was told what land she came from. Yet a noble lady who hears Perceval's story recognises the truth and reveals it. The mother is named Philosophine, and she is described as the one who, together with her cousin, brought the Grail across the sea. In this tradition, the mother is not only noble, but an original bearer of the Grail itself. Perceval also has a sister here, and the visit to the hermit uncle is repeated in a form similar to the earlier continuation. Another version presents a blunt pairing of incompatible traditions. Perceval is called the son of Alan the Fat, grandson of the Fisher King, and born at Synodon. Yet the story also preserves the forest episode in which Perceval finds a sister and then visits the hermit uncle. The two parts are placed side by side without any attempt to reconcile them. A separate prologue preserved in certain sources offers the clearest and most complete origin story. In this form, Perceval's father is Blaiocadrons. He is the youngest of 12 brothers. 11 have already died, because the family is consumed by tournaments and warlike pursuits. Blaiocadrons grieves deeply. He wants to drown that grief in more tournaments, but his wife holds him back. Shortly before the birth of their first child, he is summoned to a tournament involving rival kings and their forces. He goes and is mortally wounded, apparently in fair combat, and survives only 2 days. He is buried with honour. His wife gives birth to a son while the household is still hiding the truth. A messenger returns to find his lord already dead and buried. The widow is told that her husband has been summoned to a royal court and will not return for 8 days. The knights then decide that the truth must be broken to her gently and arrange for a holy man to deliver the news. The widow collapses and is revived. When the child is 7 months old, she chooses to withdraw into a desolate forest so that her son will never see or hear anything connected to knighthood. A senior household figure agrees to accompany her, persuading her to disguise the flight as a religious journey. The land is left in the care of a nephew, and the knights swear to hold it for the young heir. The widow travels to a coastal stronghold and then enters the forest. After 12 days of wandering, a suitable clearing is found. A house is built, and the household lives there for 14 years before the main story begins. This version is unusually coherent, and it avoids discussing the mother's lineage altogether. Wolfram's Perceval follows a different cultural landscape but echoes several striking elements. Perceval's father is Gamere, a prince who sets out to win a kingdom. He loses an older brother in battle and is crushed by grief. He marries twice, first a pagan princess, and later Herzeloid, who by earlier marriage holds queenship over 2 realms. He agrees to attend tournaments regularly as part of their marriage pact. Shortly before the birth of their first child, he is summoned east to aid a powerful ruler he once served. There, he is treacherously killed in battle and buried with great honour. His followers carry the news back to the widow. She collapses and is revived through the knowledge and skill of an old man. Soon after, her son is born. She then withdraws into a forest to raise him in ignorance of arms. Later, the story reveals that her lands have been seized and her nobles killed, implying there was once an expectation that loyal men would preserve the inheritance for the rightful heir. Wolfram also makes the mother part of the Grail lineage, sister to the Fisher King and to a hermit, and even a former Grail bearer herself, succeeded by her sister. Perceval provides yet another structure. Here, Perceval's father is Julian the Fat, linked to a sacred lineage, and one of 12 brothers, all dead in arms. The mother is Igloas, tied to Joseph of Arimathea, and she has 3 brothers, including a Fisher King and other rulers, one of whom embodies darkness as strongly as the others embody good. Perceval has a sister named Dindrain, the father does not die until after Perceval leaves home. After the departure, the mother and sister are attacked and threatened with the loss of their land. The version associated with Didot gives the father as Alain the Fat, one of 12 sons descended from bronze and a woman connected to Joseph of Arimathea. In that version, the father does not die until the son is old enough to go to Arthur's court, and the journey happens by the father's desire. A sister exists, and so does an uncle on the father's side. The Middle English Sir Perceval of Gales changes the family structure entirely. Perceval's father shares his son's name and is an honoured knight at Arthur's court, married to the king's sister named Achefleur. The father gains the hatred of the Red Knight by defeating him in a tournament celebrating his marriage. Later, during festivities marking the child's birth, the Red Knight kills him in what appears to be fair combat. The widow flees into the woods with her child, a maidservant, and a herd of goats. The Welsh Peredur presents Peredur as the youngest of 7 sons. His father and older brothers are killed in battle. The mother escapes into the forest with a small group. Women, boys, and men unused to fighting. The kind of people least able to survive the violence that has swallowed the family. The Icelandic Perceval goes in yet another direction. The father is described as a landholder of good family who marries the king's daughter. He withdraws with wife and child into the wilderness because he refuses to live among the other courtiers. The prose Lancelot, in the section where Perceval is introduced at court, repeats the forest upbringing and gives him 6 brothers, with only Aglovale still alive. The quest of the Grail, in keeping with its spiritual focus, includes Perceval's sister as well. Placed beside one another, these versions make one thing clear: there was never a single dominant account of Perceval's birth and parentage. The most persistent feature is not a name or a genealogy, but a situation. Perceval is the son of a widow, raised away from society. Everything else shifts: what caused the widowhood, why the family fled, how many siblings existed, whether the mother was royal, whether she was connected to the Grail, whether the father died in war, in a tournament, or from grief. When Chrétien's version is measured against this field, it does not sit comfortably among them. It does not match most of the surviving forms, and it matches none perfectly. One detail in particular isolates it almost completely. The withdrawal into the woods is attributed to the father rather than the mother. That inversion is nearly foreign to the wider story pattern. Nowhere else does Perceval have 2 older brothers who die together, and nowhere else does the father's death come specifically from grief over those brothers. Where Chrétien describes the boy's life in the woods, the story looks traditional. Where he explains why the family is in the woods, the story breaks from the usual logic of a widow trying to protect her only surviving child. That kind of bold reshaping is exactly what might be expected from a skilled writer taking a well-known tale and remodelling it for a courtly audience. A strong pattern emerges across multiple texts. The tradition of the father as one of 12 brothers appears again and again. It is stated directly in the Bliocadran's prologue in Perceval, and in the Didot tradition, and it is suggested in the Berne conclusion, that names Alain the Fat. This repetition does not have to be explained as the influence of any single later author, because in some versions the emphasis on tournaments and warlike habits is so strong that it clearly functions as motivation. If a family is portrayed as naturally drawn to battle, the mother's choice to hide the child becomes more psychologically convincing. Versions that make both father and sons die in combat, turning Perceval into the survivor of a larger family rather than the last child of a widow, look like later developments in which the motif has been expanded. Chrétien's version, where the elder brothers die young and through ambush, rather than a lifetime of warlike habits, departs from both the older and the later forms. If the defining feature is that Perceval is the child of a widow, the most important inheritance is likely carried through the mother. Many texts treat her as royal, often tied to the Grail kings, and in one tradition she is even tied to Arthur's own family. That suggests the father's background may have been secondary at an early stage, while the mother's lineage carried the real weight of destiny. Within the surviving romances, however, the tradition of the father as one of 12 brothers repeatedly looks older than the alternatives. Another feature appears with striking frequency: the hero's sister. In several traditions she is treated as exalted, even saint-like. The quest of the Grail magnifies her importance dramatically, but the idea does not start there. It exists in multiple continuations and in other major versions. What matters is that the continuators who claim to complete Chrétien's poem often agree with one another against Chrétien on this point, just as they sometimes agree against him in the Grail material itself. That kind of united divergence usually signals the pull of an older authority. It raises a practical question. Did these later writers invent the sister, or did they inherit her from an earlier form of the story? The first option is hard to accept because in the Perceval narrative the sister often plays only a small role. Creating her from scratch would be an odd choice if she were not needed. There is also a small but telling detail preserved in an inserted scene found in 2 manuscripts. After the boy's first encounter with knights in the forest, the leader asks him his name. The boy cannot provide a proper one and answers in the language of household endearment. The exchange runs like this in English. "Before you go, tell me what I should call you." "Sir, I will tell you. My name is Dear Son." "Dear Son is what you're called now, but surely you have another name." "Sir, truly, my name is Dear Brother." "I believe you, but if you want to speak truthfully, I do not want to know your real name." "Sir, I can tell you that my true name is Dear Sir." "By God, those are fine names. Do you have any more?" "Sir, no. I have never heard any others. By God, those are the greatest wonders I have ever heard, and I do not think I will ever hear greater." In Chrétien's story, it makes sense that the mother calls him Dear Son, and that members of her household might address him politely as Dear Sir. But Dear Brother is harder to explain. Chrétien's 2 brothers die when Perceval is an infant, and older brothers do not normally address a small child with such formal tenderness. A sister, however, would naturally call an only brother Dear Brother. The line feels like a trace of a different household structure, one where the boy truly lived in the woods, with both mother and sister. The same motif appears in Wolfram. When Perceval is asked his name early in the story, he answers in a similar way, saying that those who know him at home call him Good Son and Dear Son. The Middle English poem echoes it too. Asked who he is and where he comes from, Perceval can only reply that he is his mother's own child, come from the wild woods. Chrétien never fully builds this feature into his version. He does show the mother calling him Dear Son repeatedly, but he does not clearly state that the boy knows no other name. Later, when Perceval suddenly identifies his own name correctly, the moment feels oddly confident for a character often portrayed as naive. That inconsistency suggests that the tradition of the nameless forest child existed in the wider story world, and that Chrétien either reduced it or reshaped it. All of this points toward one of the most important connections in the entire investigation: the link between the Blaeu Cadran's prologue and Wolfram's Perceval. The similarity has been noticed before, but its depth is easy to underestimate until the details are placed side by side. In both narratives, the father's devotion to combat is emphasized. In both, the father is overwhelmed by grief after the loss of brothers, leaving him the last survivor of his line. In both, he is called away from home shortly before the birth of his first child to attend a tournament or warlike contest. In both, he is killed and buried far from home with great honours. In both, an old man plays a decisive role when the widow receives the news, and his presence makes sense only if there was an organised plan to deliver the message and manage the aftermath. In the German poem, without a background like the Blio-Cadron's account, the old man's presence in the Queen's private rooms feels unexplained. With the French prologue in mind, the scene becomes natural. Even the later details in Wolfram, including the widow's withdrawal and the loss of lands, align with what the French prologue implies. The two versions clearly belong to the same family and preserve different stages of the same narrative. The hardest question is the precise relationship. It is unlikely that one is simply copied from the other. If Wolfram created the entire opening structure, including its precise knowledge of certain Western traditions, that would require accepting that he invented a large world of detail that does not behave like invention. At the same time, it is difficult to imagine that a richly coloured source filled with Eastern references and crusading atmosphere could be stripped so completely of its distinctive identity and still remain so structurally intact. The most convincing explanation is that the Blio-Cadron's prologue is not merely an add-on or a late retelling, but a rare survival of the deeper source used by both the French and the German traditions, the kind of book that Chrétien's patron might have possessed and that multiple poets could have drawn from. If that is true, it offers a simple way to understand Wolfram's famous complaint that Chrétien told the story wrongly, while another authority told it correctly. Wolfram follows a source he treats as authoritative, and from the point where Chrétien's surviving text overlaps with his own, the stories often run close together. The sharp divergence must therefore lie earlier, before the Grail material becomes dominant. And that is exactly where Chrétien stands alone, in the opening arrangement of the hero's origins. A gifted writer working with a widely known tale might choose to break the standard opening. Instead of starting with the widow's flight, he might begin with the child's innocence and allow the mother's words to explain the past later, creating a stronger dramatic effect. That kind of literary strategy would be entirely plausible for a court poet trying to refresh a story everyone already knew. Yet the outcome is clear. Chrétien reshaped the beginning, and in doing so he replaced the older, emotionally direct motif of a widow fleeing into desolate woods with the less typical image of a wounded knight relocating his household to a woodland manor. The overall result of comparing the versions at the level of birth and parentage is straightforward. Chrétien's account is not the master source from which the others descend. In this part of the story, almost none of the other versions depend on him. The Icelandic adaptation comes closest in one particular feature, but even that stands apart. Chrétien is isolated, while other traditions repeatedly show signs of shared ancestry. Several texts preserve the father of 12 brothers motif. Several agree on death in tournament. Several give the hero a sister. Some make the mother a bearer of the Grail. Yet no two match completely from start to finish. That pattern suggests an old and extremely popular tale that already existed in multiple variants before Chrétien ever touched it. Whether Chrétien was truly the first to transform it into a courtly literary form is not certain. If the Blio-Cadron's prologue reflects a deeper written source, then the material he inherited had already been shaped into a substantial narrative before he reworked it. Later, evidence suggests the story that reached him was not pure or simple, but had already passed through one or more stages of expansion. The next phase of the legend, the records of the hero's youth, only strengthens that impression. As the field of comparison widens, the idea that Chrétien's version is secondary rather than foundational gains weight. Not because Chrétien lacked skill, but because the story world around Perceval was already older, broader, and more complicated than any single poem could contain. The scattered, sometimes conflicting accounts of Perceval's birth give way to something more continuous once the story turns to his childhood. The versions still disagree, sometimes sharply, but the pattern changes. Earlier, the contradictions came from different claims about what happened. Here, the differences mostly come from what each tradition chooses to leave out. One text includes a detail, another skips it, a third hints at it indirectly. Even when the scenes do not match perfectly, many of them can be fitted together without forcing the evidence too far. Chrétien's narrative remains the natural starting point. In his telling, Perceval's mother lives in a woodland manor that looks nothing like a desperate hiding place. The household appears substantial. There are servants, farm animals, and working fields. The place has the feel of an estate rather than a hut. Perceval already has 3 hunting spears, and although the story never explains how he got them, he uses them effectively, killing deer and moving through the forest on a riding horse. When the boy first encounters knights, he reacts before he even sees them. The sound of armor clashing in motion makes him decide that something terrible is approaching. His mother has warned him that devils are the most frightening beings in the world, and that if he ever meets them, he should protect himself with prayer. At first, Perceval prepares to fight. He intends to stand his ground and kill them if he can. Then the knights appear, and the scene flips instantly. Perceval falls to his knees, convinced he has met angels, and he begins reciting the prayers his mother taught him. He even speaks the thought aloud, in a simple and direct declaration. His mother did not lie when she said that angels are the most beautiful beings in the world, second only to God. That moment captures something distinctive about Chrétien's approach. The scene is not built like a folk tale that carefully explains every object and every lesson in advance. Instead, the story releases information only when it becomes necessary. The boy's weapons appear without explanation. The religious teaching is not described until the moment it becomes relevant. Even the deeper reason for the mother's secluded life is held back until Perceval's desire to leave forces her to reveal the truth. Events are explained through dialogue and reaction rather than through a guiding narrator. It feels like a deliberate shift toward a more literary method, where the characters carry the story forward and interpret their world in real time. The conversation with the knights follows a pattern that appears across multiple traditions. The boy asks what the pieces of armor are and what each is for. He wants to understand the strange shining skins and the weapons that come with them. That sequence remains broadly stable from version to version. The mother's farewell advice, however, changes a great deal depending on the source. In Chrétien, she gives a long list of instructions shaped by courtly values and religious discipline. Perceval is told to honour women and serve them, to do nothing that would offend them. A kiss is acceptable if a girl wishes it, but nothing should be demanded. If a woman wears a ring, a belt, or a purse and offers it freely out of affection or pity, he may accept it. He is warned not to travel long with anyone on the road or in an inn without learning that person's name. He is urged to seek the company of wise older men, because they give sound counsel. Above all, he must visit churches and monasteries. When the boy asks what those are, the mother explains the basic ideas of the Christian faith. As he leaves, he is dressed in the style of Wales, a rough outfit described as a coarse shirt and leggings made in a local fashion. When he finally reaches Arthur's court, his social clumsiness is immediate and physical. He rides up so close that the horse's head knocks off the king's cap. Later, After killing the Red Knight, he tries to strip the armor from the corpse and becomes frustrated by his inability to do it. He complains, almost like an offended child, that he thought the king would simply give him the weapons, and that he would rather burn the dead man to ashes than leave without the armor. A separate tradition preserved in the Blio-Cadran's material gives a similar setting but frames it differently. The mother, after fleeing into the wilderness, is not alone. She is accompanied by a large household. A fortified wooden enclosure is built around their home, and the place becomes a functioning settlement. There are fields and cultivated land. In this version, the boy is described as having little understanding, and his mother persuades him that no home exists in the world except theirs, and that no other people live anywhere. The boy believes her. Yet the same warning appears. When he goes into the forest to hunt, if he ever sees figures that seem to be covered in iron, he must cross himself, say his creed, and return home immediately. He goes out armed with 3 spears, and this time the story explains where they came from. They were made for him by the sons of the household leader, men skilled in that craft. The boy spends a day in the woods, sees nothing, and returns at evening. The surviving text breaks off soon after, but the shape of the childhood world is already clear. Wolfram's Perceval shares the comfortable setting but keeps traces of an older, rougher life underneath it. The mother is not simply a hidden woman in the forest. She lives with servants and resources, and the boy later speaks of her as a queen who can grant him whatever he asks. He notices jewellery and finery on the women of the household. Yet alongside that higher status, the story preserves an almost wild simplicity. The boy washes in a river. He makes a bow and arrows for himself and kills small birds. He carries hunting spears for deer. He is strong enough to haul heavy animals and bring them home himself. When he eats his first meal in a noble house, he shocks everyone with his appetite. He eats as though he is trying to fill a feeding trough. Wolfram also gives far more developed religious instruction. The mother teaches about God and the devil in an elaborate form, shaped by sharp contrasts. Light versus darkness, white versus black, good versus evil. Her parting advice includes practical warnings about avoiding unknown paths and dangerous crossings. She tells him to ride where the water runs clear, to greet people courteously, and to accept the guidance of elders. If a good woman offers him a ring, he should take it as a comfort. If she allows a kiss and embrace, it may bring him fortune and courage, especially if she is pure. The mother also tells him directly that his inheritance has been stolen by enemies. When he leaves home, he is dressed like a fool, and his beauty is emphasized more strongly than in most other versions. His behavior at court is not as crude as Chrétien's, suggesting that the mother's teaching has shaped him into something closer to a courtly figure even before he arrives. The Icelandic Perceval changes the angle again. There, the father teaches the boy to throw spears and hunt. When the boy leaves, the mother dresses him like the child of a charcoal burner and tells him he is well born but should expect contempt from others. The emphasis is less on religion and more on social humiliation and endurance. Other versions are brief to the point of sketching only the outline. The Dido tradition offers almost nothing about childhood, beyond the fact that the boy rides through woods and forests until he reaches the king's court. Perceval tells the early life through a strange symbolic scene. The father takes the boy to a tomb with a lid that cannot be lifted until the best knight in the world arrives. The boy asks what a knight is, and hears about 11 uncles, and the details of armour are explained. The next morning, hearing birds sing, he rides into the forest with 3 spears, pursues a stag, and reaches an open clearing where a white knight and a red knight are fighting. The white knight is losing. The boy throws a spear and kills the Red Knight. He returns home and tells his parents, and soon after he sets out for Arthur's court. The Middle English Sir Perceval feels older in texture. The mother's escape includes only a single maid and a flock of goats. Their dwelling is primitive. The boy is raised in the hills and drinks from a spring. His mother gives him a small spear and claims she found it in the woods. With it, he kills small birds, deer, and other game. She teaches him to pray to the creator of the world. Then the boy goes into the forest to look for God. When he meets 3 knights from Arthur's court, he believes they must be God and begins praying to them. His mother later gives him practical advice. Be moderate, greet any knight he meets, and recognize knights by the distinctive trimming on their hoods. The boy is dressed in goatskins with a hood fastened under the chin. At court, he rides so close to the king that the mare's muzzle touches the king's forehead. In the scene where he tries to take armour from the dead knight, a figure who fills the guide role, often assigned to a squire, finds him preparing to burn the corpse. The boy explains that his mother told him to burn the wood from which the iron came when the spear breaks. It is a raw, primitive detail, and it sits far from the refined tone of the French courtly style. The Welsh Peredur places the mother in the woods with a larger household, women, boys and men unused to fighting. Goats appear here too. Peredur's speed is emphasised when he chases deer and drives them home as if they were hornless goats. He entertains himself by throwing sticks and staves. Religion is lighter in this version. When he sees knights for the first time and asks what they are, his mother tells him they are angels. Her parting advice is practical and sometimes harsh. If he sees a church, say the Lord's Prayer. If he needs food and it is not offered, take it. If he hears a cry, especially a woman's voice, go toward it. If he finds a fine jewel, take it and give it away to gain praise. If he sees a beautiful woman, court her whether she wants it or not. When he leaves, he carries a handful of sharp-pointed forks. His clothing is not described. Alongside these, an Italian poem often treated as a close relative of the Perceval childhood story offers a striking parallel. In this version, the father is a noble at Arthur's court, treacherously poisoned by jealous enemies. The widow flees into the woods with her only child, living in a shelter made of branches. She tells the boy that no one exists in the world except themselves and God. One day, he finds 2 hunting spears left behind by huntsmen. When he brings them home and asks what they are, his mother says that God has sent them. He is to kill animals, eat the meat, and wear their skins. He does exactly that, carrying everything home. He grows tall, strong, and handsome. Later, hunters see him and chase him, mistaking him for a wild man. He runs back furious, accusing his mother of mocking him. She told him they were alone, but now men have appeared and attacked him. He refuses to remain in the woods. The mother has gold and jewels, and she travels with him to a town. Eventually, on advice from companions, the boy goes to Arthur's court. At court, he denies knowledge of his parentage, even though his mother has told him how his father died. He shocks everyone at the first meal by eating enough for 6. Across all these tellings, a broad conclusion emerges. The childhood material points to a well-known story, familiar in outline to many writers, but reproduced in full by none. The same basic elements keep resurfacing, but each tradition adjusts the tone, the setting, and the moral framing. Only a few texts show signs of close relationship with one another, and among those the most polished and literary forms are also the ones most shaped by their social world. The comfortable woodland estate with servants, cattle, fields, and cultivated land appears in the more developed tradition, especially in Chrétien, in the Blio-Cadran's material, and in Wolfram. That setting looks like a later stage of storytelling, where the hero's upbringing is rewritten to fit a world of rank and property. Other versions keep the mother and child closer to isolation, living with goats, drinking from streams, sleeping in rough shelters, surviving by hunting and simple tools. At the same time, the Blio-Cadran's material preserves a detail that belongs naturally to the more primitive world. The mother telling her son that no other people exist. That line makes sense when mother and child are truly alone. It becomes almost absurd when a large household surrounds them, with a leader who has many sons and servants. The contradiction looks less like an invention and more like an old trait carried forward into a newer setting, without being fully corrected. The religious layer shows a similar pattern. A simple belief in God taught by the mother to a sheltered child feels like an early baseline. Later, tellings expand it into a more elaborate system of angels and devils and formal prayers, and eventually into sophisticated moral and theological instruction. Wolfram keeps the religious teaching and deepens it dramatically, turning it into a rich contrast of good and evil. Chrétien, by contrast, tends to reveal religious instruction only when the plot demands it. The farewell advice also signals time and development. In Chrétien, the mother's warnings assume a world filled with churches, monasteries, inns, and the social rules of a settled civilization. That framework feels far removed from the bare survival logic of the earliest looking forms. If the story began as very old material shaped by mythic patterns and early social structures, then the most basic outline can still be sketched from shared features that appear again and again across multiple versions. The father's identity is often vague and not treated as central. The mother is consistently high-born, a queen in her own right, or the sister of a king. In a system where inheritance follows the mother, those two descriptions lead to the same result. The boy's status flows through her. The mother and child live alone or nearly alone in the woods. Their shelter is simple. A stream supplies water. Goats supply milk. Once the boy is old enough, he hunts birds and deer. His weapons are simple darts or spears, brought by the mother, found in the forest, or made by the boy himself. He is unusually strong, unusually handsome, and swift on foot. He believes no other people live on earth except himself, his mother, and God, and he is taught to pray to God. When he first meets knights or strangers, he either mistakes them for God or reacts in fear and confusion. That encounter triggers his departure. He goes to a king's court dressed in skins or crude peasant clothing, carrying his darts. There, he attracts attention through his beauty, his naivety, his blunt manners, and his enormous appetite. He kills a hostile knight and then reveals his ignorance while trying to deal with the corpse and the armor. From that point onward, the story branches and grows, taking different paths depending on the tradition. Some versions build the chivalric world into the fabric of the childhood. Others preserve the rough edges, keeping the tale closer to the forest. When the most consistent early features are weighed, a harsh conclusion follows. The original childhood story no longer survives in a complete form. No single extant version reproduces it faithfully, and none can be treated as the single fountainhead from which the rest flow. Two candidates are often pointed to as original in different scholarly traditions, but both stand further from the simplest reconstructible form than other sources do. The Welsh tale, in particular, is unusually thin in this section, missing many of the concrete details that give the childhood its characteristic shape. Among surviving texts, the English and the Italian versions often appear nearer to the primitive outline. They preserve more of the rough logic of isolation, hunger, simple weapons, and misrecognition. They are not perfect mirrors of an original tradition, but they seem one step closer than the heavily refined courtly treatments. Yet the story produces a paradox. One of the most developed literary works, Wolfram's Perceval, can still feel like the strongest witness to the childhood material. The style may be less polished than the French courtly voice, but Wolfram writes with vivid feeling and a sharp eye. He appears to follow a source packed with exactly the kind of concrete, picturesque detail he loves. He preserves it carefully, adds touches that heighten the scene without erasing its older features, and gives the childhood world a lived-in texture. Chrétien approaches the childhood more lightly. He seems less interested in the rustic beginnings, and more eager to bring the boy quickly into the refined social world that suits a court poet. That choice likely involved deliberate omission, and the evidence suggests that some of the missing explanations were once present in an older source. The Blaeu-Cadran's material makes one key scene suddenly clearer. There, the mother teaches the boy that if he meets iron-covered figures in the forest, he must cross himself, say his prayers and his creed, and return home because those beings are devils. In Chrétien, when the boy hears the sound of armour, he declares that devils must be near and recalls his mother's warning, even though the warning itself has not been described earlier. Then, he refuses to protect himself and chooses to confront them. When he finally sees the knights, he reverses his judgment, calling them angels, dropping to his knees and reciting prayers and the creed. The creed detail aligns closely between these two versions. In one, the mother's lesson is stated openly. In the other, the boy's strange behaviour makes sense only if that lesson is already known. The lesson in the older material explains the action in the later poem almost perfectly. This kind of fit is difficult to explain if the Blaeu-Cadran's text were merely a later invention designed to patch holes in Chrétien. Such an invention would have had to ignore the basic necessity of reading the poem it claims to supplement. It would also have had to devote most of its lines to an origin story that contradicts Chrétien directly. It would then have to achieve, by sheer coincidence, a close alignment with Wolfram, despite supposedly not knowing the German poem at all. It would also need to contain a detail like, "You are alone in the world," a line that makes natural sense in the Italian wilderness story, but becomes meaningless when inserted into a household full of people and livestock. And it would be strange for a newly composed mother's teaching to focus on devils without first establishing the presence of God and good. Chrétien contains that balance. A deliberate supplement would not likely omit it. A copyist, however, could easily drop a portion of teaching by accident. No explanation offered so far has accounted for the evidence as fully as this one. The difficulty lies not in the story itself, but in long-held assumptions about its origins. For generations, the Perceval tradition was treated as the unique creation of a single poet, whose source was believed to have vanished the moment he laid down his pen. This belief, repeated with authority, discouraged any serious search for earlier material. The story was presented as though it had appeared fully formed, seen by one pair of eyes alone, and then disappeared forever. Yet nothing in the survival of medieval texts suggests such a miraculous fate. Ink fades, parchment wears thin, books circulate, are copied, quoted, altered, and eventually lost. The Perceval source followed the same path. It was handled, read, reused, and finally worn away by time or consumed by neglect. For a long while, knowledge of the Perceval story depended almost entirely on what later copyists chose to preserve. In at least one influential version, material that hinted at multiple origins was deliberately removed in order to present the poem as a unified whole. Names were altered, authorship blurred, and contradictions smoothed away. This created the illusion of a single, coherent composition. The result was a tradition that appeared stable but was, in truth, built on selective memory. Once this veil is lifted, the story begins to reveal a far older and more complex history. Viewed as a whole, the evidence suggests that the Perceval legend began as a mythic tale shaped in a world governed by matrilineal values. In this earliest form, the father mattered little. Identity passed through the mother, who was royal in her own right or closely connected to sovereignty. The hero's inheritance followed her line. At this stage, even the hero's name may not yet have been fixed, and the story likely ended not with spiritual transcendence, but with reunion and restoration. Over time, this tale expanded. It entered literary circulation and absorbed the expectations of courtly society. By the end of the 12th century, it had already travelled far from its beginnings. Among the surviving versions, 4 stand out for preserving essential features of this transformation. 2 are elaborate and polished, shaped by chivalric ideals and later spiritual themes. 2 are shorter, rougher, and closer to the older narrative, largely untouched by religious symbolism. None depends directly on another. All appear to be independent retellings of the same foundational story. At an early stage, Perceval was not a figure of renunciation. He was a lover. The earliest layers of the legend associate him with desire, pursuit, and reward. The most familiar romance introduces him as a young knight who rescues a besieged maiden, Blanchefleur, from a rejected suitor. She comes to him in despair, declares she would rather die than submit, and receives his promise of aid. He defeats her enemies and wins her love, demanding affection rather than gold as payment. Yet instead of remaining with her, he leaves, claiming the need to find his mother. After this departure, the narrative shifts abruptly. Blanchefleur disappears from the story, as though erased. Later continuations restore her presence, but in a way that deepens the contradiction. When Perceval finally returns, he does so by accident, not intention. The reunion is joyful, tender, and unmistakably intimate. Blanchefleur explains that she waited, rebuilt her land, and remained faithful while he sought adventure elsewhere. They spend the night together, and she reasonably expects marriage. Yet once again, Perceval departs. He insists on a quest that cannot wait. Even worse, it becomes clear that this quest is tied to another woman, whose favour he seeks under oath. The hero now appears evasive, even cynical, abandoning one love in pursuit of another. This behaviour sits uneasily with the later image of Perceval as a model of virtue. The contradiction points to interference within the story itself. That interference becomes visible in an extended episode involving a mysterious woman, a magical chessboard, and the hunt for a white stag. The woman emerges from water, impossibly ageless, richly adorned and unmistakably otherworldly. She challenges Perceval, withholds her love, and imposes a task. Only by completing it may he claim her. The task is not arbitrary. The white stag is one of the most persistent symbols in early myth and romance. Its pursuit appears again and again in insular tradition, often accompanied by enchantment, transformation, or entry into another realm. The stag is never simply an animal. It marks a boundary between worlds. In many traditions, the hunt ends not with death, but with revelation. In this story, Perceval kills the stag but loses the proof of his success through interference. What should have been a swift reward becomes a prolonged wandering. The episode absorbs a vast portion of the narrative and disrupts the trajectory established by Blanchefleur's rescue. Variants of this episode appear across traditions, sometimes reduced, sometimes distorted, but always recognizable. Even versions that present Perceval as a spiritual hero retain fragments of it, like a fossil embedded in later stone. The nature of the woman who imposes the quest is key. She is linked to enchantment, longevity, and magical artifacts. She belongs to the same category as fairy figures found throughout Celtic narrative. The stag itself likely belonged to her world. Earlier forms of the story suggest that the stag was not merely hunted but transformed. In some tellings, breaking the spell reveals the true identity hidden beneath animal form. This aligns with numerous folk narratives in which a cursed being regains human shape through pursuit or wounding. When this pattern is recognized, the confusion resolves itself. The Perceval legend preserves traces of 3 overlapping stages. The earliest is a folk narrative in which a young hero raised in isolation wins a fairy lover by fulfilling a supernatural task. The second is a courtly romance, where the fairy becomes a noblewoman and the task becomes a siege and rescue. The third is a spiritual transformation, where earthly love is displaced by devotion to a sacred object, and the hero becomes an ascetic figure. The clash between these layers creates the inconsistencies that later readers struggle to explain. The fairy lover was never meant to coexist with the rescued maiden. The stag hunt was never meant to interrupt a chivalric love story. These elements belong to different stages of the legend, but survive together through transmission rather than design. Later, retellings attempted to resolve the tension. Some did so by moral reinterpretation. Marriage is described only to be stripped of physical meaning. The hero weds but remains celibate. Prophecies of descendants are introduced, even as the narrative denies the possibility of heirs. These solutions betray their own artificiality. They reflect an effort to reconcile incompatible traditions, without discarding any of them. Other fragments point back toward the older form. In one episode, Perceval is explicitly married to a woman connected to enchantment and magic, sister to a figure who controls weather and healing. In another tradition, a foreign knight of Eastern origin is rumoured to be Perceval's son, a story later reassigned to another character when Perceval's chastity became doctrinally necessary. The persistence of this motif suggests that the hero was once imagined as a father, not a virgin saint. Even in versions where the Grail dominates the narrative, the older design breaks through. Love, lineage, and worldly achievement continue to surface where they no longer belong. The legend resists purification. Its earlier identity refuses to vanish completely. These are the different love stories that gather, openly or indirectly, around the figure known as Perceval. Before drawing conclusions from them, several smaller but revealing elements of the legend deserve attention, beginning with the fate of the hero's mother. In some versions of the story, she dies at the moment her son leaves her. In others, she survives long enough to be reunited with him. This difference is not incidental. It touches the core logic of the tale itself. If the Perceval story belongs to the widespread myth pattern in which exile is followed by return, then the mother's role is fundamental. She is not merely the one who raises the hero. She is the first to be wronged, the first to lose her rightful place. The hero's struggle is not only for his own destiny, but for hers as well. In such a structure, the natural ending is reunion and restoration. Mother and son meet again. Her losses are repaired. Her position is reclaimed. This is exactly how similar stories end elsewhere. It is how the Perseus myth resolves. It is also how the English and Italian versions of the Perceval story conclude. In one telling, the hero rescues his mother from a deadly enemy and later brings her and his sister to the Grail Castle, where they live in holiness until the end of their days. These endings feel complete. They close the circle opened at the beginning. The version in which the mother dies appears to be a later development. As the story became more crowded, with new adventures and unfamiliar material, the mother's death offered a convenient explanation for why the hero never returned to her. At first, This death may have served simply to excuse his absence. Later, under the influence of spiritual interpretations tied to the Grail, her death was redefined as a punishment. The hero's failure became moral rather than circumstantial. His loss was turned into guilt. The same process can be observed in another strand of the legend, the story of the White Stag. If the stag hunt was originally a transformation tale, then it offers a key to understanding the origin of another famous narrative pattern. In its earliest form, the hero raised far from human society wins his bride by breaking an enchantment that binds her or someone dear to her. Over time, this enchantment changes shape. The fair form becomes a loathly one. The test becomes more extreme. What was once a hunt becomes a kiss. Courage replaces strength as the decisive virtue. In this way, one enchantment gives way to another, and the hero becomes the figure known from later romance as the one who dares what others will not. This connection also helps clarify a smaller but persistent puzzle in the Perceval tradition. In both French and English versions of a related tale, the hero's path is complicated by the presence of a second woman, an enchantress, with whom he remains for a long time, forgetting his original quest. In the French version, she is explicitly named the Lady of Love. Though the hero eventually marries another woman, it is this fairy mistress who holds his true affection. In the English version, she remains unnamed, but her role is the same. This raises a possibility. The nameless fairy associated with Perceval may once have carried a title similar to the Lady of Love. That title may survive in altered form in the strange names given to Perceval's wife in the English and German traditions. These names have resisted convincing explanation. There is no obvious reason why the familiar and fitting name Blanchefleur should have been abandoned. Yet these puzzling names appear precisely in the two versions that preserve the greatest number of early features. This may not be coincidence, but residue. At this stage, the story ended naturally. The hero won his bride. He restored his mother's inheritance. The arc was complete. Only later was a new element introduced, one foreign to the original design. The story was diverted from its earlier path and reshaped by mystical ideas that gradually came to dominate it. Yet rather than weakening the tale, this transformation renewed its appeal. The old story did not disappear. It adapted. Such a reconstruction could not have happened overnight. Between the earliest poem now known and the latest continuation, several decades must have passed. And yet, the changes are subtle. Even in the earliest literary version, all the elements required for a fully mystical interpretation are already present. Nothing fundamentally new had to be added. The groundwork had been laid. The transformation from folk narrative to courtly romance was already complete. What followed was the final shift, from human adventure to spiritual allegory. At this point, the story enters particularly dangerous territory for interpretation. Much has been written about the Grail and its meaning. Rather than attempting to revisit the entire problem, attention here narrows to two specific features: the sword and the nature of the Grail as understood by the earliest poet. The sword episode is among the most difficult parts of the legend. When Perceval sits beside the Fisher King, before the Grail procession begins, a servant brings a sword. The king is told that it was sent by his niece and that he may use it as he chooses. The blade bears an inscription. It is said to be made of extraordinary steel and destined to break only in a single, specific danger, known only to the smith who forged it. That smith made only 3 such swords and swore he would never forge another. The king tells Perceval that the sword was meant for him and gives it to him gladly. Yet almost immediately, the hero is warned not to trust it. A woman he meets the next morning tells him the sword will shatter. When he asks whether it can be repaired, she answers that it can, but only with great difficulty and only by the smith who made it. She names a lake and a forge and warns him that no other hand may touch the blade. Soon after, the warning proves true. In battle, the sword breaks. What follows varies sharply between versions. In some, the pieces are simply set aside and forgotten. In others, a messenger sent by the Fisher King retrieves the fragments without the hero's knowledge and returns them to the castle. In one telling, the king places them on a bier and declares that only the one who can restore the sword will heal him and complete the Grail quest. This moment is revealing. The bier does not belong to Perceval's story. It belongs to another cycle altogether. Its presence here betrays an attempt to fuse two different traditions. The copyists were trying to reconcile contradictions they did not understand. They sensed that the broken sword mattered, but no longer knew why. Later versions attempt simpler solutions. A smith repairs the sword without ceremony. The place is unnamed. The peril is forgotten. The story is flattened. A much fuller explanation appears elsewhere. In this version, Perceval awakens in the night to the sound of a bell and a mysterious voice telling him his sister is in danger. By morning, the castle has vanished. He rides through a radiant meadow and comes upon a wondrous fortress filled with music so beautiful that all sorrow is forgotten. He tries to enter. No one answers. In impatience, he strikes the gate with his sword. The blade breaks in two. An old man appears and rebukes him. "This is the gate of paradise," he says. "It cannot be forced. Because of this act, the hero's quest will be lengthened." The old man gives him a letter with healing power and disappears. The castle vanishes as well. Later, Perceval learns of a forge near a lake. The smith who lives there forged 3 swords. One of them was the sword now broken. The smith has known for years that the sword would break at the gate of paradise. His life is bound to it. When he reforges it, he will die. Perceval fights his way to the forge, defeats monstrous guardians, and confronts the smith. The blade is restored. The smith dies soon after. Bells toll across the land. This version is clear, coherent, and rich in meaning. Every detail aligns with the earlier hints. The mysterious peril is explained. The broken sword has purpose. Even a strange prayer taught to Perceval earlier in the story finds its place here, used not against men, but against creatures beyond human strength. Nothing suggests this episode was invented late. On the contrary, it reads like an original core that later versions struggled to preserve. The confusion found elsewhere arises not from invention, but from loss. The sword, then, was never meant to be merely another weapon. It was a test. Its breaking marked a boundary between earthly force and forbidden knowledge. Only patience, humility, and return could restore it. At first glance, this version looks like a muddled blend of what appears in the French tradition and what later writers expand. The smith carries the same name, and the king's name feels close enough to hint at a shared memory. Yet one detail immediately seems to break the logic. A sword that fails on the second blow sounds even less useful than the weapon in the earlier French telling. That impression is persuasive only if it is assumed that both poems are talking about the same blade. A closer reading suggests something else. The sword described here behaves like a different kind of object altogether, shaped by a different set of ideas. A comparison from Welsh narrative tradition helps clarify what may be happening. In one tale, a hero must defeat an enemy under a strict rule. He may strike only once. If he strikes twice, the enemy will return whole again the next day. The warning is not about weakness, but about a strange condition attached to victory itself. The implication is that the weapon or the act has a special power that works only within a single, controlled moment. The second blow does not continue the success of the first. it cancels it. That kind of rule makes little sense for ordinary combat, but it fits perfectly in stories, where the weapon is less a tool of steel and more a symbol of a force of nature. This is why the sword in the German poem begins to resemble a sun weapon, not in the sense of literal sunlight made into metal, but in the way it operates. It can accomplish what is required in a single decisive stroke. A second stroke undoes the work. The repair method points in the same direction. When the blade breaks, it is not fixed by a forge and hammer, but by immersion in spring water. That is not a realistic method for steel. It sounds like an image, a memory of something that bends, seems to break, and then appears whole again under different conditions. The mind reaches for one obvious model, a straight line entering water and seeming to snap because of refraction, while remaining intact. Another model is older and more mythical. The sun itself, imagined as sinking into water and rising again, renewed. It matters that the act must be done before dawn. That timing belongs to the daily rhythm of light, not to the schedule of a smith. So even if both traditions preserve traces of a common source, the swords that appear in the poems as they now exist are not identical. One story is built around a blade whose failure and repair are tied to an older, symbolic logic. The other story uses a weapon in a different way, and later, copyists struggle to make the parts fit. That struggle produces one of the most stubborn puzzles in the material. Why the sword story seems to split into competing versions that refuse to align. Any attempt to solve this has to be cautious because the evidence is tangled and the manuscripts rarely agree cleanly. Still, one possible explanation stands out because it matches the shape of the problem. An early form of the Grail story, often linked by scholars to an older narrative stream in which Gawain is the central figure, included a broken sword. In that earlier pattern, the hero's ability to restore the weapon is a decisive test. Success means fitness for the quest itself. The origin of that broken sword is not clear today, and the earliest source behind it remains out of reach. But one fact is consistent across the larger tradition. Gawain is repeatedly tied to swords with unusual properties. A sword motif belongs naturally to his kind of story, where heroic trials are expressed through weapons and feats. A later form of the Grail story, shaped by explicitly Christian meaning, had no real need for such a sword. Its central objects were the lance and the Grail, understood as relics connected to the Passion. In that more devotional framework, Perceval becomes the hero most closely associated with the sacred procession. A sword can be added, but it is not structurally required. And when a sword does appear in the shared source, behind both the French and German poems, it may represent a different invention entirely, introduced with a different backstory to replace the older broken weapon test. Yet popular memory does not always accept replacements. If an earlier sword trial had already gripped listeners, it would resist being pushed aside. The newer weapon might drift out of the tale, while the older, broken sword returns, carrying its original function with it. In that situation, Perceval ends up facing the same test, once designed for Gawain, even if the surrounding story has changed. This is one of the few explanations that accounts for the way the traditions overlap, contradict, and then partially merge. Even that does not answer another question. Where did the French sword episode come from in the first place? One tempting possibility is that it echoes a famous northern legend centered on a master smith and a set of exceptional swords created under extraordinary conditions. The king's name in the French material has a northern sound. The smith's name may even hide a wordplay that would be noticed by audiences familiar with the older story. In some versions of the northern legend, the smith is physically crippled to prevent escape, and the name could be heard as a hint in that direction. This cannot be proven, but the clustering of details makes the suggestion hard to ignore. Northern material had a remarkable ability to travel. In medieval Europe, few legendary figures spread so widely beyond their homeland as the story of the Great Smith, known in English tradition as Wayland. His name appears in context far from Scandinavia, and the idea that fragments of his legend would enter romance is not far-fetched. There is even later evidence that the Arthurian world and the Wayland tradition had already crossed paths by the late 13th or early 14th century. A medieval inscription associated with a famous sword uses language that recalls the way romances speak about blades, forged with obsessive labour, marked by an origin story, and strengthened through a deliberate act of tempering. When the larger Arthurian tradition is surveyed, the parallels with northern narrative patterns are striking. A sword fixed in a stone or pedestal as a test of kingship recalls earlier northern motifs. A broken sword restored as part of a hero's destined achievement recalls other heroic cycles. Yet the German sword, with its odd one-blow rule and water restoration, does not feel purely northern. It leans toward Celtic logic, where magical rules and symbolic actions often matter more than practical mechanics. If that is correct, the introduction of this version may be traced to a different channel of influence, perhaps one associated with the source used by the German poet. This may also explain why some manuscripts make the sword break twice under different conditions, as if two story logics have collided. A text can preserve both because it is copying from an environment where both traditions were circulating at the same time. The result is not neat, but it is revealing. It shows how the cycle is not a single invented structure, but a living system built from multiple layers that were never fully reconciled. With that, attention shifts from the sword to a larger question that has troubled readers for generations. What did the earliest French poet believe the Grail actually was? Did he treat it as directly bound to the life and death of Christ, or did he treat it as a mysterious, sacred object without a clear definition, revered more for its aura than for its theology? His description is vivid, but not fully explanatory. A maiden enters carrying a grail in both hands. A light fills the hall so powerful that candles seem dim beside it, as stars fade when sun or moon rises. The object is made of fine gold and set with precious stones of unmatched value. It passes before the hero again and again through the meal, completely uncovered. Yet the meal itself is not described as being produced by the Grail. The hero eats as the other knights eat. The Grail is present, but not used like a magical feeding dish in this scene. Later, an explanation arrives, through a hermit figure who tells the hero that the Grail serves the Fisher King's father. It carries a single consecrated wafer, and this alone sustains the old man's life. The wording makes it clear that the Grail is not simply a talisman. It is tied to a Christian rite, whether the poet imagined it as a vessel that holds the host directly, or as something like a display object used in devotion. The point remains the same. It functions as a container for the sacrament. In that sense, the Grail is treated as a Christian relic, not merely a magical treasure. That makes the German poem's version of the Grail all the more startling. There, the Grail is not a golden vessel at all, but a stone brought to earth by angels. It preserves youth. It postpones death. It chooses its own servants by revealing names on its surface. A community of knights and maidens lives around it under strict rules. Even marriages within that world are governed by the Grail's decision. Only one feature connects this stone directly to Christian ritual. Each Good Friday, a dove descends and places a consecrated wafer upon it. The origin of the Grail is said to have been written in the stars and discovered in Toledo. This is not a small difference in emphasis. It is a contradiction in the object's very nature. How could two poems that otherwise track the same story, outlined so closely, disagree so sharply here? Either they did not share a source, or the tradition they inherited was still fluid, and each poet built clarity out of uncertainty. Yet there is strong evidence pointing toward the first option. Both drew from the same basic source, and the Grail story already existed in a developed Christian form before either poet wrote. Certain manuscripts preserve a line that matters enormously. They claim to be telling the story as the book declares, and they say that book was written at Fécamp. The line appears across different manuscript families rather than belonging to only one branch, which suggests it was not a late invention. It likely came from the common ancestor behind them. So what was the book associated with Fécamp? The most plausible answer is a fully Christian Grail narrative, connected to a powerful local relic tradition. Fécamp was famous for a holy blood legend, preserved in Latin and French texts, and later shaped into verse. For a long time, scholars knew this tradition existed, but did not connect it directly to early Grail romance in a decisive way. The manuscript evidence changes that balance. The Fécamp story begins after the crucifixion. Joseph and Nicodemus remove Christ's body from the cross, and Nicodemus gathers the dried blood from the wounds. A portion is hidden in a glove. When Nicodemus dies, the relic passes to his heir, who is told that it will protect him from poverty so long as he honours it. The relic is kept secretly and adored. The secrecy causes trouble. A wife, unaware of what is being preserved, accuses her husband of idolatry. The accusation cannot be proven, but the danger is enough to force flight. A vision warns of Jerusalem's coming destruction. The relic must be hidden for safety, placed inside a fig tree along with a second object, stored in sealed tubes. The tree closes over the hiding place so perfectly that no mark remains. Later, another warning comes. The land is no longer worthy to hold such a treasure. The tree must be cut down and entrusted to the sea. The trunk is carried by waves and eventually washes ashore in Normandy, giving the place the name Fécamp, explained as a memory of the fig tree. The next part of the story moves into the landscape of saintly foundations and local conversion. Holy men arrive to bring Christianity to the valley. A family settles there. Children discover the fig trunk and its miraculous offshoots. The trunk itself resists movement until an angel, appearing as a pilgrim, transports it to the site where the abbey church will later stand. Then comes a scene that sounds as if it belongs to the same mythic vocabulary as Celtic romance. A duke hunts a white stag. The animal, pursued by hounds, takes refuge beside the fig trunk. Horses and dogs refuse to approach. The duke, shaken by the sign, vows to build a chapel on that spot. He dies before he can fulfill the vow fully, and the chapel decays. Later, a saint arrives, misunderstands the valley's significance, and suffers a near-fatal illness. In a visionary trance, the true story is revealed, and his life is extended so he can restore the sanctuary. The site is founded again, destroyed in later raids, and restored once more after conversion and political change. At a dedication festival, an angel appears again in the guise of a pilgrim, places a knife on the altar, and then rises into heaven, leaving behind a footprint in stone. From then on, the abbey flourishes under powerful patrons. The story ends with an appeal to faith and prayer, insisting that holy people approved the tradition, and miracles confirmed it. One crucial detail becomes clearer in the Latin versions. The second object hidden in the fig tree was a knife. It had been used to scrape the dried blood from Christ's wounds. This explains why the Fécamp tradition preserves both blood and blade. It also suggests that the later appearance of a second knife in the story, the one placed on the altar by the angel, may have emerged because the earlier explanation faded while the fact of the relic's presence remained. The tradition remembered that Fécamp held both the holy blood and a knife, and narrative logic created a second dramatic arrival to account for it. When the historical layers are separated from the miraculous framework, the cult's antiquity still remains strong. The abbey's major foundation in its later form is securely placed around the end of the 10th century. Written testimony for the miracle stories and the relic tradition appears by the late 11th or early 12th century. Later still, another miracle in the region creates a new sacred object. During Mass, the elements are said to become flesh and blood. The chalice and paten associated with this event are carried to Fécamp and preserved with the knife. In the later 12th century, an abbot orders the relics, previously concealed, to be displayed publicly on the high altar. At that point, the implications for Grail studies become hard to avoid. Here is a narrative with Joseph and Nicodemus, sacred blood, a vessel-like preservation, accusation of idolatry arising from within the household, exile and travel, concealment in wood, delivery by the sea, discovery in the west, and a shrine growing around the relic. In everything except the name, it functions like a complete Grail legend, and it can be traced earlier than the romances that survive in literary form. It also offers a direct explanation for a detail long considered puzzling: the presence of knives in the German Grail procession. Attempts to explain these knives as a misunderstanding of a single French word never fully satisfied, especially for readers who take seriously the German poet's claim that he did not depend on the French poem. A single tailor does not naturally turn into two knives. The Fécamp tradition does. It gives a knife used to collect sacred blood, and later a second knife arriving in a miraculous scene at the altar. It even aligns with the way the German poem uses knives, scraping a harmful substance from a lance as if repeating, in altered form, the older action of scraping blood from wounds. Other versions of the Grail story preserve a related narrative strand in which Joseph gathers Christ's blood into a precious object made of gold, keeps it hidden, prays before it daily with candles burning, and is eventually persecuted. In that same strand, Nicodemus is described as making an image of the crucified Christ with divine help, then committing it to the sea. This detail points toward a famous relic, tradition, centered on a miraculous crucifix, said to have been carved by Nicodemus and carried to the West by miracle centuries earlier. The story assumes an audience used to pilgrimage culture, people who knew shrines, relic claims, and sacred legends as part of their world. Whether the Fécamp legend influenced the Grail romances, or the Grail romances influenced the Fécamp legend, the result is similar. The Grail tradition must be older and more developed than it is often treated. But there is an additional reason to think Fécamp played an active role rather than a passive one. From early on, the abbey had a confraternity of minstrels attached to it, a community that endured for centuries and lived under official charters. In other words, this was not only a place where relics were guarded. It was also a place where stories were carried, performed, and spread. In a world where narrative travelled by voice as much as by parchment, that matters. The confraternity operated under the protection of Saint Martin. Each year on the saint's feast day, every minstrel was expected to join the procession and offer 5 deniers at the altar. Membership was not limited to entertainers alone. Knights and clerics were also admitted, and whatever goods members left behind at their death were assigned to the benefit of the church. According to the charter that records these rules, the confraternity had been founded by the abbey's first abbot, William, who governed from around the year 1000 until 1031. It was later reaffirmed by his successor, Henry, who held office in the middle of the 12th century. The abbot who confirmed the charter, Raoul of Argence, clearly regarded the institution as an inherited and established body, rather than a recent innovation. The purpose of such a confraternity can hardly be misunderstood. Its role was to promote, circulate, and reinforce the legends associated with the abbey itself, ensuring that its sacred stories remained widely known and publicly remembered. Fécamp was not unique in maintaining such an organisation. Other monasteries did the same. The widespread popularity of the Guillaume d'Orange stories, for example, owed much to the activity of the minstrels attached to the monastery of Saint-Guilhelm du Désert. The involvement of monastic centres in shaping and spreading romantic cycles has not yet been fully acknowledged, but the evidence strongly suggests that monasteries were active participants, rather than passive guardians. The cult surrounding the Volto Santo followed a similar pattern, with legends carried outward by performers rather than confined to cloisters. The ties between Fécamp and England were long-standing and continuous. Under the first abbot, a member of the English royal family entered the order. The second abbot later visited the court of Edward the Confessor and received royal donations that were confirmed and expanded after the Norman conquest. The Norman kings maintained a close relationship with the abbey, founded by their ancestor, and later abbots were drawn directly from the highest levels of Anglo-Norman nobility. One such abbot, related to King Stephen, accepted Fécamp only after failing to secure a major English bishopric. On one side of the channel stood Joseph of Arimathea, the Grail, Glastonbury, and the Sacred Thorn. On the other stood Nicodemus, the Holy Blood, Fécamp, and the Sacred Fig Tree. Communication between the two sides was constant. The earliest surviving Grail poem refers explicitly to a book at Fécamp as its source. Another romance closely related to that poem introduces into the Grail procession the distinctive relic of Fécamp, the knife. These converging details make it difficult to deny that traditions crossed, merged, and reshaped one another over time. The reference in the Perceval narrative occurs during the episode known as the Dolorous Mountain, immediately following a mention of Vauchier of Denain. This section is securely attributed to him. Vauchier's patron was Philip of Namur, nephew on his mother's side to the Count of Flanders, who had once lent the original Perceval source to Chrétien. Few writers of the period would have been better positioned to see or hear that source directly. Given the identity of the author, the presence of the reference across all manuscript families, and the striking appearance of knives in Wolfram's Grail procession, the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. The wording must already have existed in the common source shared by both Chrétien and Wolfram, and that source appears to have been shaped under the influence of the Fécamp tradition. For the Grail to be affected in this way, it must already have reached a stage where it was understood as a Christian object closely tied to the Passion. Long before Chrétien, it must have assumed the form of a sacred ecclesiastical relic. The foundation date of the minstrel confraternity makes it highly likely that the Fécamp version of the story existed at the beginning of the 11th century. Minstrels were not a standard feature of monastic life. When they appear attached to a specific foundation, it is usually because that foundation possessed a legend it wished to spread. The Christian Grail romance likely predates any complete surviving text by at least a century. Its pre-Christian form, rooted in folklore, is far older and far more difficult to date. Another passage of interest appears during Gawain's arrival at a castle where he sees silver dishes piled high with boars' heads. This suggests that the compiler understood the word grail simply as a serving dish. In a parallel copy, the term is replaced outright with platters, This variation may illuminate the puzzling appearance of a carving dish in Chrétien's Grail procession. In that scene, it is not a sacred vessel, but an ordinary dish large enough to carve venison upon. Earlier traditions described the Grail as a food-giving object. Later, Christian writers describe it as the dish of the Last Supper. Still later, it becomes a chalice. It is possible that during an intermediate stage, memories of the earlier food-giving function survived, before the symbolism of the Mass fully transformed the object's meaning. The question then arises whether Perceval's connection to the Grail is essential or accidental. Earlier assumptions favoured an intrinsic link. Closer study suggests otherwise. The original Grail hero appears to have been Gawain. Nothing in the earliest Perceval material requires the Grail development. Perceval's path to the Grail Castle is indirect, one of several possible routes. His role as a breaker of enchantments, his association with vengeance, and the early fusion of Gawain and Perceval storylines all offer explanations for how the association arose. As the Grail story became increasingly moralized and Christianized, Perceval's character proved more adaptable to spiritual interpretation, allowing him to replace Gawain without erasing the older structure. Many episodes following Perceval's departure from the Grail Castle are not crucial to understanding the poem's development. One episode, involving a lady in a tent, appears to be an independent tale awkwardly inserted. Another episode, involving blood drops on snow and a trance of love, belongs clearly to folklore and may have been part of Perceval's story from an early stage. This incident appears consistently across versions and likely predates Chrétien. The true structural turning point comes with the appearance of the Loathly Maiden. She publicly rebukes Perceval for his failure at the Grail Castle, and foretells the disasters that will follow. She then announces a series of knightly challenges. One involves a fortress defended by hundreds of knights and their ladies. Another promises greater fame to the knight who rescues a maiden besieged on a mountain. Immediately afterward, the knights divide the tasks among themselves. One quest, however, the Dolorous Mountain, is undertaken without having been announced at all. This omission appears in every version and suggests the survival of an older narrative layer. Before these plans can unfold, a new figure abruptly enters the court and accuses Gawain of treacherous murder. He challenges him to single combat after 40 days. Gawain accepts. From this point onward, the narrative abandons Perceval almost entirely and follows Gawain through tournaments, courts, recognitions, and perilous encounters. A pledge to rescue a besieged maiden quietly vanishes, replaced by a new obligation involving the bleeding lance. Chronology collapses. 6 weeks in Gawain's story correspond to 5 years in Perceval's. Eventually, Perceval disappears from the narrative for thousands of lines. This confusion cannot be explained by careless composition alone. The most coherent explanation is that the Perceval story had already absorbed 2 separate Gawain traditions before reaching Chrétien. The first was a collection of short, episodic tales centered on a fortress of pride. This group likely represents one of the oldest layers of Arthurian romance, possibly dating back to the 10th century. These tales circulated orally among minstrels and were later partially written down. The second Gawain tradition was far more elaborate and literary. It centered on a marvelous castle and featured an unjust accusation against Gawain. This poem was well known in literary circles and heavily used by later copyists. Large portions of it can still be traced within the Perceval continuations. The sections following the accusation align closely with this lost poem, explaining both their coherence and their divergence from Chrétien's narrative intentions. From this point onward, manuscript variation increases dramatically. Texts split into longer and shorter versions, yet none follow either consistently. Some passages appear in full in otherwise abbreviated texts, while others vanish unexpectedly. This pattern suggests not random alteration but selective borrowing from a shared source. The inconsistencies are therefore not the result of multiple authors writing independently, but of multiple traditions colliding. Older folkloric material coexists with later literary compositions. Copyists worked with stories already layered by centuries of transmission. Within this framework, Gawain's journey repeatedly carries him into a realm beyond ordinary geography. The land he enters is one from which no knight returns, though women pass through unharmed. The descriptions align closely with the idea of the otherworld, a realm of the dead. The marvellous castle, its strange rules, its imprisoned inhabitants, and the prohibition against departure all support this interpretation. The location of this realm is described as lying beyond a river, and its name has often been equated with Galloway. Whether medieval writers truly intended the identification is uncertain, but Galloway's reputation as a wild western borderland may have encouraged such associations. Early historical sources connect Gawain himself with that region, reinforcing the link. As Chrétien's portion of the poem ends, variation becomes more pronounced. Some versions include elaborate rituals of thanksgiving. Others focus on speeches of gratitude. The castle's walls glitter with the armour of newly made knights, dazzling onlookers who fear enchantment. Gawain prepares for combat, makes confession and receives absolution in passages of striking moral depth. These extended confessions, preserved fully in only one manuscript, bear every mark of belonging to an older, independent poem rather than later embellishment. The arrival of the enemy host is described in sweeping detail. Thousands of knights advancing in ordered ranks, banners and polished armour flashing in the light, followed by thousands of noble women accompanied by musicians. Shorter versions compress this spectacle, preserving its outline but losing its grandeur. Throughout these scenes, certain knights appear where they should not, disappear where they should be present, or are renamed to avoid contradictions. These adjustments betray the copyist's struggle to reconcile incompatible sources. When the messengers reach the camp, they find Guiromelans in the midst of being armed. He is standing upright, supported on either side by two knights, while his greaves are fastened to his legs. Some versions omit this final detail, but it deserves attention as its significance becomes clear later. In the descriptions preserved by several traditions, the knight's appearance is striking. His hands are visibly curved from long use of arms, shaped by years of holding sword and shield. It is a small detail, but one that conveys a lifetime of combat. Guiromelans receives the messengers with perfect courtesy. He explains that they are the very knights he most wished to see. At the same time, he speaks with fierce hostility toward Gawain, and declares himself ready to fight at once. The combat that follows is described at great length in all versions, though its individual blows matter less than the emotional tension surrounding it. One account, however, diverges sharply from the others. It expands the role of Clarissons, whose distress is mentioned everywhere but nowhere else developed so fully. Here, her inner conflict is laid bare. She is torn between loyalty to her brother and love for the man he now fights. Her grief is doubled and it threatens to break her heart. Reason urges her to mourn her brother above all else, reminding her of his honour, his deeds, and the blood they share. Love answers back, insisting that affection freely chosen weighs more heavily than kinship imposed by birth. Love reminds her that a brother may be replaced, but a beloved once lost can never truly be recovered. The argument between reason and love unfolds within her mind, each voice pressing its claim. Reason warns that passion deceives, and that love is unstable, shifting as easily as a hawk released from the fist. Love counters that true devotion belongs to those who are brave, courteous, and worthy, and that such love cannot be denied without injustice. Clarisan's falters between these claims, her colour fading, her strength failing, until she can no longer bear the struggle. At last she resolves that she cannot abandon her brother, even if it means the loss of her lover. She submits to necessity, praying only that peace may be granted where human choice has failed. Another version places this lament before the combat rather than during it, but the substance remains the same. In every telling, Clarisans embodies the tragic conflict between blood and desire, between inherited duty and chosen love. It is clear that beneath the variations lies a single dramatic conception, an internal debate as vivid as the external battle it interrupts. With Clarisan's intervention, the fight comes to a halt. At this moment, the two major narrative traditions part ways. One follows a line that unfolds naturally from the events, providing a resolution that fits the logic of the story. The other diverges, briefly losing coherence, before forcing the characters back into alignment through a sudden and awkward return. This divergence explains why the longer version must be regarded as earlier and more faithful to the underlying narrative logic. At this point, it becomes useful to turn to the German tradition. It has long been assumed that the parallels between the French and German poems end with the unfinished portion of Chrétien's work. Close comparison shows otherwise. Although the German poem reshapes events boldly to keep its central hero constantly in view, traces of the same earlier stories remain clearly visible beneath the surface. One of the two earlier narrative strands is deliberately removed at its first appearance. It no longer serves a structural purpose, and its presence would only confuse the unfolding plot. Instead, the messenger announces only the marvel of the enchanted castle, identifying it as both her place of origin and her destination. This omission reveals a keen sense of narrative construction and confirms that the reshaping occurred at the level of the source, not in translation. From the point where Chrétien's poem breaks off, the German narrative follows the same broad sequence as the French versions. The messenger goes directly to the queen, finding her at prayer, absorbed in concern for Gawain's safety. In several French versions, the court later gathers in solemn thanksgiving at a church, a detail mirrored in the German poem. In both traditions, the queens of the enchanted castle watch from their windows as Arthur's host gathers below. In the German version, the elder queen recognizes the arms and emblems of the knights, a natural detail for one who once ruled them. The movements between castle and camp are expanded with characteristic German richness, but the framework remains the same. One detail is particularly revealing. Arthur explains to the Lady of the Land that, while passing through her territory, his knights encountered resistance, and that one of them, a knight known elsewhere under a slightly different name, has been captured. This name corresponds exactly to a knight who, in the French tradition, is at that very moment imprisoned elsewhere. The coincidence is too precise to be accidental. The arrival of Guiromelans, the ordered advance of his host, and the presence of noble women in his retinue all correspond closely to the fullest French account. The messengers find him in precisely the same stage of preparation, supported by companions as his armour is secured. From this point onward, the German poem diverges again, bringing Perceval back into the foreground. Yet even here the grief of Clarisans reappears, transformed but recognisable, followed by her appeal to Arthur. Later still, the German tradition records Gawain's return to the land of Escavalon, his vindication from false accusation, and the reconciliation that follows. If both the French and German poems draw upon a shared source, The unavoidable conclusion is that this source contained the complete resolution of the Enchanted Castle narrative. Across all surviving versions, there exists a remarkable mixture of agreement and divergence. Every text tells the same essential story, yet no two texts align perfectly. From each, individual lines and passages can be extracted that are word for word identical, even though the surrounding material differs. One group preserves a clear explanation of how Gawain wins the Enchanted Castle, matching indications embedded earlier in the story. Elsewhere, those same texts display little concern for narrative consistency. Most striking of all are a number of extended passages of exceptional literary quality that appear in unexpected places, inserted into versions where, by logic alone, they do not belong. These passages often correspond closely with shorter forms preserved elsewhere. At a certain point in the story, these anomalies cease. Beyond that boundary, except in one later episode, the text settles into a more uniform pattern. The question then becomes unavoidable. Did a scattered group of copyists working independently suddenly and simultaneously develop a refined literary talent, composing elaborate scenes that fit the story perfectly, only to abandon this creativity immediately afterward? Or did all these copyists draw, knowingly or not, from a substantial and widely known poem that already contained these episodes? The answer is self-evident. Just as Chrétien relied on a literary source for the Perceval material, so too did he rely on an equally developed source for the Gawain episodes. That source was known to his continuators. While only fragments of the Perceval source may ever be recovered, the Gawain material survives in sufficient quantity to make partial reconstruction possible. Beyond this point, attention turns to what that lost poem may have contained in its complete form. Two endings suggest themselves. One is unavoidable. Gawain must return to Esgavalon and clear his name, whether or not he has found the sacred lance. The other is equally plausible. The passing of a year allows for further adventures before that final return. The surviving texts preserve examples of both possibilities. Most follow the first path, while a smaller number preserve the second. These latter versions contain a sequence of adventures that, although limited in number, are significant for understanding how the tradition evolved. In these accounts, Gawain rides long into the night, endures storm and solitude, and encounters a maiden bearing an ivory horn. She warns him that the land belongs to a lady who imprisons knights. When the horn is stolen by a passing warrior, Gawain pursues and kills him, returning the horn to its owner. In gratitude, she gives him a ring that multiplies his strength. Soon afterward, a deformed dwarf appears and reproaches Gawain for abandoning an earlier quest. The resemblance between this figure and the loathly messenger of the Grail story is unmistakable. The rebuke is similar in tone, though directed at a different failure. This correspondence suggests that the episode may preserve an older form of the accusation motif. Later, Gawain unwittingly reveals himself as the slayer of a knight when the corpse bleeds at his approach. He is attacked by avengers and narrowly escapes death. This motif appears repeatedly across Arthurian tradition and is always associated with Gawain, never with another hero. Its recurrence here strongly suggests authenticity. Further adventures follow: a haunted house, a forced combat, captive maidens freed. These episodes are competent but lack the narrative force of the central material. When the Grail Castle appears again, the version combines features from multiple traditions. The wounded king lies on a couch. The Grail and lance pass in procession. A sword arrives from a royal niece. Yet there are also weeping maidens, a broken blade, a mysterious sleep, and an awakening in desolation. This version appears stable and consistent across manuscripts, suggesting that it was shaped once, deliberately, rather than altered repeatedly by copyists. Eventually, Gawain reaches the mountain fortress announced earlier. He defeats its guardians, enters a hidden vault sealed for 100 years, and takes a sword said to have belonged to an ancient hero and brought into the land by a sacred figure. The sword grants victory only when used justly. The symbolism is unmistakable, but the Christian framing feels imposed rather than original. At the close of Chrétien's portion, the evidence allows a clear assessment. The Perceval story did not originate as a literary invention, but grew from folklore through successive stages of transformation. By the time Chrétien wrote, it already existed in developed poetic form. He did not create its heroes, its relics, or its central mysteries. He reshaped them. The Grail had already been Christianized before his hand touched the story. Gawain's adventures had already been sung and written. Arthurian romance existed before Chrétien, not merely as oral tale, but as structured literature. His achievement lay in style, not invention. The story must now be followed back to the moment when the Grail messenger first arrives and announces the trials that Arthur's knights are called upon to face. By this point, the narrative has already become layered. An earlier cycle of heroic exploits, in which Gawain clearly stood at the centre, had been displaced before Chrétien's time by a later grouping of adventures that still honoured him but rearranged his role. To understand the complexity of the surviving text, it becomes essential to separate these two strands and to treat them as distinct traditions, rather than as parts of a single, unified design. In their surviving form, the two castles at the heart of these stories are fundamentally different. Chastel or Guelus is presented throughout as an openly hostile fortress. It exists in opposition to Arthur and his authority. It was built and defended against him, and any knight of the Round Table who approaches its walls can expect immediate challenge. Its knights are always eager to joust, each fighting in honour of a chosen lady. The lord of the castle may bear different names in different tellings, but he is always distinguished by exceptional strength, beauty, and prowess. Nothing supernatural surrounds this place. There are no enchantments to be broken, no otherworldly forces at work, only the raw testing of chivalric skill. Chastel Merveilleuse stands in sharp contrast. Here, the atmosphere is unmistakably uncanny. The knights within its walls are of varying ages. Some have not yet been knighted and wait for the arrival of a destined lord, who alone can confer that honour upon them. They do not ride out to joust, nor do they openly associate with the women of the castle. Both knights and ladies appear bound by an unseen power, a captivity that threatens even the eventual victor. There is no hostility toward Arthur or his men, and no ruling lord before Gawain's arrival. In one tradition, the castle belongs to an aged queen, while in another it is controlled by the architect of its enchantments, who is prepared to surrender it to whoever can undo his spell. Between the two castles, as they are now presented, there is no shared feature. When Chastel Merveilleux is examined on its own terms, it reveals itself as a substantial and carefully shaped poem, rich in invention and literary ambition, and likely composed not long before Chrétien himself wrote. Nothing in it suggests a known author or identifiable source. The material associated with Chastel or Guelus, however, is of a very different character. It consists not of a single, flowing narrative, but of a series of largely independent tales, unified only by the figure of Gawain. Throughout these stories, there are repeated references to the size and importance of the larger collection from which they come, and more than one hint at the identity of the poet responsible. One version of the text consistently suppresses or alters any passage that might challenge the idea of a single author. As a result, the true nature of this section has long been obscured. Had a different manuscript tradition been favoured earlier, the critical importance of this continuation and the strong case it makes for an insular origin of much Arthurian material would likely have been recognised much sooner. The scope of the material involved is vast, and any analysis can only open the ground rather than exhaust it. The surviving stories naturally fall into three areas: the tales themselves, their relationship to other known narratives, and the question of authorship. Before turning fully to Chastel Orgelus, it is worth noting that two major episodes intervene between the conclusion of Chastel Merveilleuse and the resumption of the earlier thread. These episodes, centred on Brune de Branlon and Carados, interrupt the flow and extend the narrative significantly. Their relevance becomes clearer only after the Orgelus material is examined in detail. The Orgelus sequence begins with Arthur and his knights hunting in the forest. On their return, the king rides alone, silent and withdrawn. Gawain notices his mood and presses him for an explanation. Arthur admits that too much time has passed since he last held full court and summoned his nobles. Their first recorded encounter is the episode involving Kay and the roasting spit. Seeking food, Kay enters a house where a dwarf is roasting a peacock. Offended by the dwarf's behaviour, Kay beats him, only to be struck in return by the lord of the house. When Gawain arrives and asks for hospitality, he is welcomed with courtesy. At this point, the storyteller remarks that the tale is already long and must be shortened, the first clear sign that the original source was far more extensive. The knights then reach a place known as the Garden of Graves, a site filled with peril and marvels so numerous and strange that no living person could believe them fully true. The narrator refuses to describe them here, saying the time is not yet right. This implies that the earlier collection included a full account of a dangerous cemetery adventure. Next comes the episode at the Castle of Brandelis. Gawain's relationship with his sister is revealed. A fierce combat ensues, a lady and her young son intervene, and reconciliation follows. This episode is one of the most powerful in the entire work. At its conclusion, the narrator directly addresses the audience, urging them to pray for the soul of a man associated with the tale, and repeats the appeal again. A habit found nowhere in Chrétien or in the Enchanted Castle narrative. The story then turns to the capture of Chastel Orgelus and the liberation of Giflet. The lord of the castle, known as the Rich Warrior, is striking in beauty and nearly giant in stature. The land honours the Virgin above all, and no jousts are held from Saturday afternoon until Monday. During this pause, Gawain encounters the lord lost in a trance of love, distressed by the delay of his beloved. A series of jousts follows. Lucanes is captured, Kay is tricked into defeat, while others win honour. At last, the Rich Warrior himself prepares to joust. His arming is treated as a ritual. Horns sound as each piece of armour is fastened. A final blast announces that he has mounted his horse. The duel that follows is long and brutal. Gawain, wielding Excalibur, ultimately prevails through a sudden surge of strength. The defeated lord refuses to yield, fearing the shame will destroy his lady. He appeals to Gawain's courtesy, asking him to pretend defeat and accompany him to the castle. Gawain agrees. The deception succeeds, the lady is sent away, the prisoners are freed, and Arthur celebrates what is described as his greatest victory, attributed explicitly to the authority of Blaheris. Returning to Brandelis, chaos awaits. Gawain's young son has been abducted while playing. Gawain bluntly declares that he knows nothing of searching for children and leaves the task to others. This attitude, combined with later details about the boy's identity, hints at the social world in which the story took shape. Gawain returns to court with Giflet, Kay, and a renowned lady. The court women prepare anxiously to receive her, each asking the other whether she appears suitably adorned. The narrator insists that the story has been told truthfully, and condemns any who would claim otherwise, suggesting that multiple versions were already circulating. Afterward comes Gawain's Grail adventure, undertaken on behalf of a slain knight. Before he departs, a passage appears urging prayers for the dead and announcing a branching of the great tale. The narrator names another storyteller, possibly the same individual for whom prayers were earlier requested, hinting at the transmission of the text through personal ownership. The boy fights his first combat, tries vainly to revive his fallen opponent, mourns the damage to his shield, and wins a new one of gold and ivory. He undertakes exploits that resemble no known cycle associated with his name. In one passage, his story takes on the tone of a transformation tale, recalling older mythic motifs. Eventually, he guards a ford and unknowingly fights his own father. They return together to court, where the boy is entrusted to Ywain for training, contradicting earlier claims that his upbringing would not be told. His name, later given as the Fair Unknown, is said to have been bestowed by Arthur himself, echoing insular versions of the tale rather than continental ones. At court, an unexplained incident occurs. A stranger enters the hall, takes armour and a horse, and vanishes without challenge. Gawain alone sees him and is deeply angered, but the story offers no resolution. Clearly, this episode once had a continuation that is now lost. The narrative then openly declares a break and shifts to another branch of the great tale, introducing a new adventure involving a dead knight in a boat, whose wound can only be avenged by a single chosen hero. This episode carries the story forward until Perceval re-enters the scene. Later still, the focus returns to Gawain. A magical shield is introduced, one that can only be borne successfully by a knight whose lady is faithful. Its guardian is a dwarf knight of extraordinary beauty and strength. At this point, the narrator explicitly names Bleheris as his source, and identifies him as a man of Wales whose stories were cherished by a noble patron. Further adventures follow. Gawain rescues a lady whose lover is too passive to act. He meets his son again, now named Gwynplaine, who seeks his father's aid in a war threatening Arthur. Gawain intervenes, and through valour and wisdom restores peace. When the Gawain material is viewed as a whole, its nature becomes clear. The stories are loosely connected, interchangeable in order, and unconcerned with consistent chronology. They form not a single epic, but a vast collection of independent tales, bound together only by the figure of Gawain. Repeated references to a great overarching story suggest a source of immense scope, now largely lost. The same authority is named for both the central and concluding episodes, reinforcing the idea that all derive from one tradition. It is likely that some tales were moved or reshaped as new narrative cycles, particularly those involving Gawain's son, were introduced. Everything about the language suggests oral performance, appeals to listeners, direct addresses, and formulaic expressions point to transmission by professional storytellers. Over time, these tales absorbed new material, especially as Perceval rose in popularity. The story of Gawain's son appears to have been reshaped under the influence of Perceval's own youth and anonymity. The story must now be followed back to the moment when the Grail messenger first arrives and announces the trials that Arthur's knights are called upon to face. By this point, the narrative has already become layered. An earlier cycle of heroic exploits, in which Gawain clearly stood at the centre, had been displaced before Chrétien's time by a later grouping of adventures that still honoured him but rearranged his role. To understand the complexity of the surviving text, it becomes essential to separate these two strands and to treat them as distinct traditions, rather than as parts of a single, unified design. In their surviving form, the two castles at the heart of these stories are fundamentally different. Chastel Orgueillus is presented throughout as an openly hostile fortress. It exists in opposition to Arthur and his authority. It was built and defended against him, and any knight of the Round Table who approaches its walls can expect immediate challenge. Its knights are always eager to joust, each fighting in honour of a chosen lady. The lord of the castle may bear different names in different tellings, but he is always distinguished by exceptional strength, beauty, and prowess. Nothing supernatural surrounds this place. There are no enchantments to be broken, no otherworldly forces at work, only the raw testing of chivalric skill. Chastel Merveilleuse stands in sharp contrast. Here, the atmosphere is unmistakably uncanny. The knights within its walls are of varying ages. Some have not yet been knighted and wait for the arrival of a destined lord, who alone can confer that honour upon them. They do not ride out to joust, nor do they openly associate with the women of the castle. Both knights and ladies appear bound by an unseen power, a captivity that threatens even the eventual victor. The story then turns to the capture of Chastel Orgueillus and the liberation of Gifle. The lord of the castle, known as the Rich Warrior, is striking in beauty and nearly giant in stature. The land honours the Virgin above all, and no jousts are held from Saturday afternoon until Monday. During this pause, Gawain encounters the lord lost in a trance of love, distressed by the delay of his beloved. A series of jousts follows. Lucanes is captured. Kay is tricked into defeat, while others win honour. At last, the Rich Warrior himself prepares to joust. His arming is treated as a ritual. Horns sound as each piece of armour is fastened. A final blast announces that he has mounted his horse. The duel that follows is long and brutal. Gawain, wielding Excalibur, ultimately prevails through a sudden surge of strength. The defeated lord refuses to yield, fearing the shame will destroy his lady. He appeals to Gawain's courtesy, asking him to pretend defeat and accompany him to the castle. Gawain agrees. The deception succeeds, the lady is sent away, the prisoners are freed, and Arthur celebrates what is described as his greatest victory, attributed explicitly to the authority of Bleheris. Returning to Brandalis, chaos awaits. Gawain's young son has been abducted while playing. Gawain bluntly declares that he knows nothing of searching for children and leaves the task to others. This attitude, combined with later details about the boy's identity, hints at the social world in which the story took shape. Gawain returns to court with Gifle, Kay, and a renowned lady. The court women prepare anxiously to receive her, each asking the other whether she appears suitably adorned. The narrator insists that the story has been told truthfully and condemns any who would claim otherwise, suggesting that multiple versions were already circulating. Afterward comes Gawain's Grail adventure, undertaken on behalf of a slain knight. Before he departs, a passage appears urging prayers for the dead and announcing a branching of the great tale. The narrator names another storyteller, possibly the same individual for whom prayers were earlier requested, hinting at the transmission of the text through personal ownership. Following the Grail episode, Gawain wanders through many lands, performing deeds the narrator declines to describe. The focus shifts instead to his son, now old enough to fight. The chronology collapses. The boy behaves like a youth newly entered into the world, yet is capable of battle. The stories no longer align in time. The boy fights his first combat, tries vainly to revive his fallen opponent, mourns the damage to his shield, and wins a new one of gold and ivory. He undertakes exploits that resemble no known cycle associated with his name. In one passage, his story takes on the tone of a transformation tale, recalling older mythic motifs. Eventually, he guards a ford and unknowingly fights his own father. They return together to court, where the boy is entrusted to Owain for training, contradicting earlier claims that his upbringing would not be told. His name, later given as the Fair Unknown, is said to have been bestowed by Arthur himself, echoing insular versions of the tale rather than continental ones. At court, an unexplained incident occurs. A stranger enters the hall, takes armor and a horse, and vanishes without challenge. Gawain alone sees him and is deeply angered, but the story offers no resolution. Clearly, this episode once had a continuation that is now lost. The narrative then openly declares a break and shifts to another branch of the great tale, introducing a new adventure involving a dead knight in a boat, whose wound can only be avenged by a single chosen hero. This episode carries the story forward until Perceval re-enters the scene. Later still, the focus returns to Gawain. A magical shield is introduced, one that can only be borne successfully by a knight whose lady is faithful. Its guardian is a dwarf knight of extraordinary beauty and strength. At this point, the narrator explicitly names Bleheris as his source and identifies him as a man of Wales whose stories were cherished by a noble patron. Further adventures follow. Gawain rescues a lady whose lover is too passive to act. He meets his son again, now named Gwinglan, who seeks his father's aid in a war threatening Arthur. Gawain intervenes and through valour and wisdom restores peace. When the Gawain material is viewed as a whole, its nature becomes clear. The stories are loosely connected, interchangeable in order, and unconcerned with consistent chronology. They form not a single epic, but a vast collection of independent tales, bound together only by the figure of Gawain. Repeated references to a great overarching story suggest a source of immense scope, now largely lost. The same authority is named for both the central and concluding episodes, reinforcing the idea that all derive from one tradition. It is likely that some tales were moved or reshaped as new narrative cycles. Particularly those involving Gawain's son were introduced. Everything about the language suggests oral performance. Appeals to listeners, direct addresses, and formulaic expressions point to transmission by professional storytellers. Over time, these tales absorbed new material, especially as Perceval rose in popularity. The story of Gawain's son appears to have been reshaped under the influence of Perceval's own youth and anonymity. The episodes attributed to Perceval in this part of the tradition do not form a single unified narrative. Instead, they unfold as a layered sequence drawn from different sources, different moments, and different storytelling traditions. When observed closely, these adventures seem to fall into three broad currents. Some belong to an older stratum of storytelling, likely part of an early heroic tradition and possibly once included among the tales surrounding the stronghold known as Chastel or Gelus. Others clearly derive from a Grail-centered romance associated with Perceval, whether from the same source later used by Chrétien or from a parallel tradition now lost. A third group resists precise classification and may represent additions made by the compiler himself, shaped by his own hand rather than inherited from earlier song or tale. These distinctions are not always easy to draw. Oral tradition rarely respects sharp boundaries, and stories shift as they pass from voice to voice. Yet, taken as a whole, the adventures largely conform to this pattern. The earliest episodes resemble the deeds once told of Gawain, self-contained exploits, dramatic enough to stand alone, and easily imagined as independent narrative poems. The later episodes, by contrast, are more tightly bound, to the broader arc of the Grail story and display a more overtly chivalric tone, less concerned with episodic freedom and more with moral testing and spiritual consequence. The first incident encountered in this sequence is Perceval's meeting with a huntsman who reproaches him for his earlier failure at the Grail Castle. This scene appears in most surviving versions. It presupposes knowledge of Perceval's previous visit to the Grail, and therefore belongs firmly to the Grail tradition, rather than to the older heroic Leia. The episode itself adds little beyond reminding the listener of a fault already committed. The next adventure, set at a castle associated with a horn and involving Perceval's defeat of a king described variously as ruler of Ireland or of the Norsemen, is preserved across all versions. Yet it too passes quickly, offering no deeper insight into the structure of the legend. What follows, however, is far more revealing. Perceval arrives at a river and recognizes that the Grail Castle lies on the opposite bank. He rides along the water, searching for a crossing, and comes upon a ruined fortress, sometimes described with great richness of detail. In its inner court, he encounters a maiden who offers to help him cross. She mounts a mule and leads him to the river bank, where a boat waits. As Perceval prepares to step inside, voices from the far shore cry out in warning. They tell him the maiden intends to drown him. He withdraws at once, and she vanishes without explanation. In many tellings, the people who warn him are returning from a great wedding feast held by King Brandigan, where they have witnessed extraordinary marvels. The scene is vivid and haunting, especially in versions that linger on the eerie stillness of the river and the sudden disappearance of the maiden. She is clearly no ordinary woman, but something older and more dangerous. Later, interpreters have often treated this episode as an attempt to block Perceval's Grail quest, yet the story itself offers little support for that view. Perceval shows no urgency to reach the Grail Castle. Once across the river, he deliberately takes another road. Neither love nor the Grail exerts real force here. The smallest obstacle is enough to divert him. Next comes the episode of the chessboard and the stag hunt, which together form the backbone for many of the adventures that follow. The story of the knight who hides in a tomb appears here in two distinct forms, one clearly later than the other. The simpler version, in which the knight takes refuge in the tomb and Perceval does not pursue him, almost certainly belongs to the older tradition. At this point, several versions insert a cluster of episodes that seem curiously empty of purpose. Perceval encounters a huntsman who claims to have roamed the region for 30 years, without ever hearing of the Fisher King's castle. That night, Perceval lodges with him. The next morning, he meets a bloodied valet fleeing from a mounted knight. When Perceval asks the reason for the pursuit, no answer is given. The knight overtakes and kills the valet. When questioned again, he responds coldly that no one who pauses to explain himself can accomplish anything. Offended by this reply, Perceval attacks and kills him as well. He then rides on, regretting that he never learned who either man was or why they fought. The story continues without resolving this emptiness. Perceval spends the night with a hermit, arranging burial for the dead men. The next day he meets an old knight riding a white mule, a hawk on his wrist. The knight reproaches Perceval as the slayer of his brother, the Red Knight. Perceval explains that Arthur himself granted him the armour. The old man accepts this and lets the matter rest. He then tells Perceval that he knows he is seeking the Grail Castle. Just the day before, he says, the king's daughter was boasting of having stolen a small hunting dog from the knight who failed to ask the Grail question, simply to spite him. Perceval rejoices at hearing how near he is to his goal, but once again, lost in thought, he misses the road. These scenes feel thin and mechanical. Better versions of the Red Knight story exist elsewhere, and the introduction of a daughter of the Grail king conflicts with other traditions. Perceval's repeated absent-mindedness, whenever he approaches the Grail, stretches credibility. These episodes were likely late inventions or borrowed from inferior romances. The next adventures pass quickly. Perceval kills a lion and defeats its master, sending him captive to Arthur. He overcomes a giant and frees a maiden imprisoned in a fortress, leaving her the land and riding on. He encounters the White Knight of the Ford of Love, a story that survives elsewhere in a far more vivid form, suggesting this is a reduced version of an older tale. Afterward, Perceval meets a young knight who introduces himself plainly. He says that the Bretons call him the Fair Unknown. He declares that Gawain is his father, the man he loves more than any other, even more than Gaheris, whom Gawain dearly loves. Later, he will speak to Gawain himself in much the same words. Perceval then comes, almost by chance, to Blanchefleur. Her city is said to stand by a great river, likely the Humber. The episode seems drawn from a longer romance, perhaps even from the same source as Chrétien. But nothing in its surviving form allows firm conclusions. A strikingly different episode follows. Perceval meets a knight riding with a woman of extraordinary ugliness. She is hideous beyond measure, yet richly dressed and supremely confident. Perceval laughs despite himself, provoking the knight to challenge him. The knight is defeated and explains that his name is the Fair Wicked One, son of the Count of Galloway, and that the woman he loves is named Rosette. He loves her so completely that he cannot bear separation from her, not even for an hour, and is jealous of all men, even his own father. Perceval remarks on the depth of his devotion and sends the pair to Arthur's court to declare it openly. Their arrival causes astonishment. Courtiers stare in disbelief at the lady's appearance and struggle to contain their laughter as her knight praises her beauty. Kay mocks them cruelly and asks whether more such maidens exist in the knight's land, hoping to claim one for himself. Arthur rebukes him sharply. The pair remain at court, and the story ends with a startling claim. The woman was, in truth, the most beautiful maiden in the world. The narrator offers no explanation. The contradiction is left unresolved. The story clearly belongs to an ancient motif, the transformation of the loathly lady, a theme deeply rooted in Celtic tradition and closely associated with Gawain himself. The compiler records it faithfully, even if its meaning escapes him. Perceval then visits his mother's home and meets his sister, a figure unknown to Chrétien. This episode must come from a biographical tradition about Perceval that diverged early from the Grail romance. Here, Perceval is said to know only the Lord's Prayer, nothing more, despite other accounts claiming he learned special prayers from a hermit. Even the identity of the hermit shifts. In this version, he is the brother of Perceval's father, not his mother. Perceval claims to have fallen asleep in the Grail Castle and remembers nothing of leaving it, a detail that fits Gawain's story, not his own. The contradictions multiply. A return to older ground follows with the story of the Castle of Maidens. This version is simple, luminous, and unmistakably drawn from folklore. The maidens are all alike in age and rank, dressed in green embroidered with gold, their hair shining. They themselves built the castle, without masons, raising it through enchantment. At first the hall is empty. Only after Perceval strikes a brazen table repeatedly does anyone appear. Had he lacked courage, he would have been left alone all night. The maiden's beauty is so overwhelming that Perceval believes himself in paradise. In the morning, the castle vanishes, and he wakes beneath an oak. Later versions turn this fairy palace into a convent or moral allegory. Here, it remains what it always was, a tale of enchantment, untouched by doctrine. Perceval next recovers the stolen stag's head and learns the true story of the Knight of the Tomb. He encounters again the Maiden of the White Mule, witnesses strange lights in the forest, endures a storm, and is told that the light came from the Grail itself. She lends him her mule and ring so he may safely reach the Grail Castle. Yet even now, Perceval delays. He crosses a perilous bridge that shifts beneath him, attends a great tournament at Chastel Augelus, and wins the prize. The bridge itself has a story. A knight loved by a fairy woman, a hunt devised to trap him, a bridge left unfinished after his death, open only to the bravest. The theme is ancient, part of the same family as the tales of Gwyngomor. After the tournament, Perceval loses the mule and ring. He follows a small hound instead, guided by an unseen voice. He reaches the chessboard castle once more, then wanders again, freeing a knight hung upside down by Kay before the story turns back to Gawain for a time. Only then does the compiler finally name himself. The variations of his name are many, but they point to a single figure, now identified as Warshier of Denain. From this point, the narrative hastens toward its close. Perceval meets a strange child in a tree who speaks of Mont Dolores, a place where only the bravest may succeed. There he learns of a pillar devised by Merlin to test Arthur's knights and of prophecies spoken at Arthur's birth. This is the only moment where the Perceval story touches the legendary history of Britain. At last, Perceval reaches the Grail Castle. The procession appears, the Grail, the lance, the broken sword. He nearly succeeds in restoring the blade, but not fully. The king embraces him and grants him lordship. The story seems to end here. What follows belongs to another hand. The sword breaks again. The king is wounded. The logic collapses. The ending does not satisfy. The likely truth is that Warshier never finished his task. Whether through death or deliberate withdrawal, the work stops abruptly. What remains is a rich but tangled inheritance. Ancient heroic tales, fairy stories, Grail symbolism, and later moral interpretation, all layered together. The confusion is not accidental. It is the visible trace of legend in motion, caught between worlds. Out of the darkness, something passes like a flare of light. It might be the Grail, or it might be the echo of a story that has lost its balance. Perceval's road seems, again and again, to approach an ending, only for the path to fracture. Bridges shift, castles vanish, ugliness turns into beauty, and the narrative slips away once more. This is where the true power of the material lies. There is no single, fixed version, no final authority. Each episode is an old melody, reshaped by a different voice. Perceval may appear to be searching for a sacred vessel, but the deeper pursuit is meaning itself. Yet legends do not deliver meaning cleanly. They delay it, distort it, and scatter it across time. What remains at the end is not a completed triumph, but a living mystery, passed from hand to hand, altered by every retelling, never fully resolved, and therefore never exhausted.